Hey everyone, welcome back to The Sleep Detective. Tonight we embark on a deeply unsettling psychological journey into one of the most studied minds in criminal history, Ted Bundy. Over the next 4 hours, we'll explore not just what Bundy did, but how his mind worked differently from the rest of us. This isn't about glorifying evil, but understanding it. We'll dive deep into the psychology of charm and manipulation, the development of psychopathy, and how a seemingly normal person can harbor such darkness. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this comprehensive analysis. Before we start this extensive psychological exploration, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what draws you to criminal psychology. There's something profound about trying to understand the incomprehensible, and tonight we'll attempt to do just that. If you find value in these deep psychological analyses, subscribing really helps the channel grow. Tonight's journey will take us through childhood trauma, personality development, manipulation tactics, and the final psychological breakdown of a killer who fooled everyone around him. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, but his story begins with a psychological wound that would shape everything that followed. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried and only 22 years old. In the conservative 1940 seconds, this was a source of deep shame. To hide the illegitimate birth, Ted was raised believing his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. This fundamental deception about his very identity created what psychologists call an attachment disruption. This attachment disruption is a core psychological injury that affects how someone relates to others for their entire life. When a child's basic understanding of family relationships is built on lies, it creates what psychologists term ontological insecurity, a deep uncertainty about one's place in the world. Ted would later discover the truth about his parentage, but by then, the psychological damage was done. His sense of self was built on a foundation of deception, teaching him from the earliest age that reality could be manipulated. The Cowell household, where Ted spent his early years, was itself psychologically toxic. His grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was described by family members as a violent, racist man with an explosive temper. There are reports of him swinging neighborhood cats by their tails and throwing family members downstairs. This environment of unpredictable violence and cruelty provided Ted with his first lessons in how power could be used to control and hurt others. Children learn not just from what they're taught, but from what they observe. Samuel Cowell also had a substantial collection of pornography, which Ted discovered at a young age. The psychological impact of early exposure to pornographic material, particularly in a context of family dysfunction, has been extensively studied. For Ted, this material provided a distorted template for how sexuality and power intersect. He would later describe becoming obsessed with pornography, particularly violent pornography, which fed into developing fantasies that would eventually drive his crimes. The combination of early exposure and psychological vulnerability created a perfect storm. When Ted was 4 years old, his mother moved them to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Bundy, a hospital cook who adopted Ted and gave him his surname. While this might seem like a positive change, the psychological impact was complex. Ted was uprooted from the only family he'd known, given a new father figure, and expected to adapt to an entirely new life. For a child already struggling with identity issues, this transition was deeply destabilizing. Johnny Bundy was described as a kind man, but Ted never formed a strong attachment to him. The early signs of Ted's psychological abnormalities began appearing in childhood, though they were subtle enough that they went largely unnoticed. One of the most chilling early incidents occurred when Ted was 3 years old. His Aunt Julia woke up to find young Ted placing kitchen knives around her body while she slept, and he was smiling. When she asked what he was doing, he just walked away. This incident reveals early signs of what psychologists call callous unemotional traits, a lack of empathy combined with manipulative behavior. Ted's academic performance was excellent from an early age, which masked many of his psychological problems. He was intelligent, articulate, and charming when he wanted to be. This created what psychologists call a successful psychopath profile, someone whose intelligence and social skills allow them to function effectively in society while harboring deeply disturbed psychological patterns. His teachers saw a bright, well-behaved student, while underneath, more disturbing patterns were developing. This intellectual camouflage would become one of his most dangerous assets. The psychology of Ted's adolescent years reveals increasing signs of what would later be diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder. He became an accomplished shoplifter and burglar, not because he needed the items he stole, but because he enjoyed the thrill and the sense of power it gave him. He was careful never to get caught, which demonstrates the calculating nature of his antisocial behavior. This wasn't impulsive acting out, it was methodical criminal behavior driven by psychological gratification rather than material need. During his teenage years, Ted also began exhibiting what psychologists call predatory behavior toward women and girls. He would follow them, spy on them, and engage in what he later described as practice runs for more serious crimes. These behaviors reveal the development of sexual sadism, a pattern where the individual derives sexual pleasure from the psychological or physical suffering of others. The fact that these behaviors were planned and repetitive shows they weren't random urges, but developing psychological patterns that would later escalate. Ted's first serious romantic relationship came in college with Stephanie Brooks, a wealthy, sophisticated woman who initially fascinated him. However, when she broke up with him, citing his lack of direction and ambition, Ted experienced what psychologists call narcissistic injury, a devastating blow to his self-image that triggered intense rage and a desire for revenge. This relationship pattern would repeat throughout his life: initial charm and seeming devotion, followed by manipulation, control, and ultimately violence when he felt rejected or threatened. The psychological significance of the Stephanie Brooks relationship cannot be overstated. Many of Ted's later victims bore a striking physical resemblance to her young, attractive women with long, dark hair parted in the middle. This targeting pattern reveals how deeply the rejection affected his psychology and how it became integrated into his violent fantasies. He wasn't just killing random women. He was symbolically killing Stephanie Brooks over and over again, working through his psychological trauma by inflicting it on innocent victims who happened to resemble her. Ted's college years also revealed his capacity for sustained deception and manipulation. He excelled academically, volunteered for political campaigns, and worked at a crisis hotline counseling suicide victims. On the surface, he appeared to be a model citizen, engaged, caring, and committed to helping others. However, this was all part of what psychologists call his mask of sanity, a carefully constructed facade designed to hide his true psychological nature and provide him with access to potential victims while maintaining his reputation. The development of Ted's mask of sanity reveals sophisticated psychological manipulation skills that he honed throughout his young adult years. He studied how to appear normal, how to charm people, and how to gain their trust. This wasn't natural behavior for him, it was learned behavior, carefully practiced and refined. He observed how normal people behaved and mimicked those behaviors so effectively that even trained professionals were fooled. This level of conscious deception indicates the presence of primary psychopathy. The psychology behind Ted's choice to work at a crisis hotline is particularly disturbing. Rather than genuine empathy for suffering, he was likely drawn to this work because it gave him insight into human vulnerability and psychological pain. He could study how people in crisis behaved, what made them vulnerable, and how to exploit that vulnerability. Additionally, working in such a role provided him with an excellent cover who would suspect someone who spent their time helping others of being a killer. Ted's political involvement also served psychological purposes beyond mere career ambition. Working on campaigns gave him access to social networks, enhanced his public image, and provided him with skills in persuasion and manipulation that he would later use to lure victims. The political arena taught him how to present himself as trustworthy and charismatic, skills that would prove deadly when applied to his criminal activities. He was essentially learning the tools of his trade through legitimate activities. As we examine these early psychological patterns, we see how Ted Bundy's mind was developing along distinctly abnormal lines. The combination of early trauma, genetic predisposition to antisocial behavior, and environmental factors created a psychological perfect storm. Unlike the popular image of the monster, who is obviously different, Ted developed into what psychologists call a successful psychopath, someone whose disorder manifests in manipulation and charm rather than obvious social dysfunction. This made him infinitely more dangerous. The most chilling aspect of Ted's psychological development was how deliberate and calculated it was. He wasn't driven by uncontrollable impulses, he was methodically building the skills and persona he would need to become an effective predator. Every charm, technique, every manipulation tactic, every aspect of his public persona was carefully crafted to serve his darker purposes. This level of premeditation reveals the truly calculating nature of his psychological disorder and the sophisticated planning that went into his criminal career. By his early 20s, Ted had assembled all the psychological tools he would need for his killing spree: the ability to charm and manipulate others, a complete lack of genuine empathy, sophisticated deception skills, and a growing set of violent sexual fantasies focused on control and domination. The stage was set for one of the most brutal and calculating serial killing careers in American history. Understanding these early patterns is crucial because they reveal how monsters are made, not born. Understanding these early psychological patterns challenges our assumptions about what evil looks like and forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look exactly like the people we trust most: charming, intelligent, successful individuals who have learned to weaponize our most basic human instincts for connection and trust. Ted Bundy's case teaches us that evil can wear a pleasant face, speak in educated tones, and present itself as everything we've been taught to trust. The psychological foundation had been laid through years of careful development. The mask was in place, perfected through constant practice and refinement. The fantasy life was developing, fed by years of violent pornography and rejection trauma. And somewhere in the darkness of Ted Bundy's mind, the urge to kill was growing stronger, waiting for the right moment to manifest in the most horrific ways imaginable. The charming young man was already becoming a monster. The transformation from troubled youth to sophisticated predator didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of psychological development, skill acquisition, and fantasy refinement that took years to reach its deadly fruition. The mind we've examined tonight was already dangerous, but it was still developing, still refining its techniques, still building toward its ultimate expression. Understanding this developmental process is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in others and potentially preventing future tragedies. The psychology of evil may be complex, but it's not incomprehensible. As we prepare to delve deeper into Ted's psychological toolkit in our next segment, remember that every technique he developed, every skill he mastered, every aspect of his carefully constructed persona was designed for one ultimate purpose: to gain access to vulnerable victims and satisfy his growing need for control, domination, and ultimately, murder. The foundation was complete, the tools were assembled, the mask was perfected, and somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, young women were going about their daily lives, completely unaware that a predator was among them. The boy who placed knives around his sleeping aunt had grown into a man who could convince anyone of his harmlessness. The psychology behind this transformation reveals truths about human nature, societal blind spots, and the terrifying adaptability of evil that continue to be relevant decades after Ted's execution. Understanding this psychology is our best defense against recognizing and stopping similar predators before they can claim their first victim. The mind behind the mask was complex, calculating, and utterly without genuine human empathy. This psychological development didn't happen in a vacuum, it occurred within our society, using our values and expectations as camouflage. Ted Bundy's psychology teaches us that evil can adapt, can learn, can present itself in the most acceptable forms while harboring the most unacceptable intentions. As we continue our exploration, we'll see how these psychological foundations supported one of the most sophisticated and deadly predators in criminal history. The stage was set for a reign of terror that would shock the nation. The most disturbing realization from studying Ted's early psychology is how many warning signs were present but missed or dismissed. The early violence toward animals, the pathological lying, the manipulative behavior, the lack of genuine emotional connection all were visible to those around him, but were either overlooked or rationalized away. This teaches us the importance of recognizing these patterns early and taking them seriously, rather than making excuses for behavior that might seem charming on the surface, but reveals something much darker underneath. As we conclude this first segment of our psychological journey, we've established the crucial early patterns that shape Ted Bundy's development from a troubled child into a sophisticated predator. These psychological foundations, the identity confusion, the early trauma, the careful construction of a false persona, and the gradual development of violent fantasies created the framework for everything that would follow. In our next segment, we'll explore how these foundations manifested in his extraordinary ability to charm and manipulate others. The transformation was complete. The mask was perfect. The predator was ready to hunt. And the psychology we've examined tonight provides the crucial foundation for understanding how one of history's most notorious killers was able to operate so successfully for so long, hiding in plain sight while claiming victim after victim. The mind behind the mask was finally ready to reveal its true nature to the world, using the psychological weapons it had spent years perfecting. The development we've traced tonight was all building toward the creation of a perfect psychological weapon, a man who could inspire trust while planning murder, who could appear helpful while plotting harm, who could seem completely normal while being utterly monstrous. Understanding how this weapon was forged in the crucible of early trauma and careful psychological development is essential for recognizing and stopping similar predators before they can perfect their deadly craft. The foundation we've examined tonight supported the development of one of the most sophisticated and deadly predators in criminal history. Understanding how this foundation was built, brick by psychological brick, helps us recognize similar patterns in others and potentially prevent future tragedies. The mind behind the mask was ready to begin its deadly work, armed with psychological weapons that would prove devastatingly effective against unsuspecting victims who saw only charm where they should have seen danger. The stage was set, the psychological tools were assembled, and Ted Bundy was ready to begin his transformation from disturbed individual to one of history's most notorious serial killers. The charming facade was complete. The manipulation skills were honed to perfection, and the violent fantasies were ready to become reality. In our next segment, we'll explore how these psychological foundations manifested in the deadly art of charm and manipulation that made his crimes possible. As we continue our deep psychological exploration into Ted Bundy's mind, we now turn to perhaps his most dangerous weapon, his extraordinary ability to charm and manipulate others. This wasn't natural charisma, but a carefully crafted psychological tool that he honed to perfection over years of practice. Understanding how Bundy's charm worked gives us crucial insights into the psychology of manipulation and helps us recognize similar patterns in other predators who use our own social instincts against us for the most sinister purposes. The psychology of psychopathic charm is fundamentally different from genuine charisma. While normal people develop social skills to build authentic relationships and connections, psychopaths like Bundy develop these skills purely as tools for exploitation. Every smile, every gesture, every seemingly caring response was calculated to achieve a specific psychological effect. He studied human behavior not to understand and connect with others, but to manipulate and control them more effectively for his own purposes, treating people like objects to be moved around on a chessboard. Bundy's charm operated on multiple psychological levels simultaneously. On the surface level, he was physically attractive, well-dressed, and articulate qualities that create an immediate positive impression in most social interactions. But deeper than that, he had an uncanny ability to read people's psychological needs and present himself as the person who could fulfill those needs. This psychological mirroring is a sophisticated manipulation technique that exploits our fundamental human need to be understood and valued by others in our social environment. One of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of Bundy's charm was how he used it to exploit societal assumptions about trustworthiness. In the 1970s, society had clear ideas about what dangerous people looked like. They were supposed to be obviously threatening, antisocial, or strange in their behavior. Bundy deliberately presented himself as the opposite of these stereotypes. He was clean-cut, educated, politically active, and seemingly compassionate, creating psychological camouflage that allowed him to operate in plain sight among his potential victims. The psychological mechanism behind Bundy's manipulation involved what experts call impression management taken to an extreme level. Most people engage in some degree of impression management. We present ourselves differently in job interviews than we do with close friends. But Bundy's impression management was total and calculated. He created entirely different personas for different situations and relationships, each designed to extract maximum psychological advantage from the people around him. This level of conscious performance indicates severe personality pathology. Bundy's manipulation of women reveals particularly sophisticated psychological techniques that exploited socialized gender roles and expectations of the era. He understood that many women had been socialized to be helpful and nurturing, so he would often approach potential victims by appearing injured or in need of assistance. The fake cast on his arm or the crutches weren't just props, they were psychological weapons designed to trigger women's caring instincts and lower their natural defenses against potential threats. The psychology behind Bundy's fake injury routine demonstrates his understanding of what researchers call reciprocity bias, the human tendency to help those who appear to need our assistance. When someone asks for help, especially someone who seems educated and trustworthy, most people feel psychologically compelled to respond positively. Bundy exploited this fundamental aspect of human psychology, turning our capacity for compassion into a vulnerability he could exploit for his own deadly purposes. This represents the weaponization of human kindness. Bundy also demonstrated sophisticated understanding of what psychologists call social proof, the tendency to look to others' behavior to determine appropriate actions in ambiguous situations. By approaching victims in public places like college campuses or shopping centers, he was implicitly communicating that he was safe because he was operating in spaces where dangerous people wouldn't be expected. The presence of other people around made his targets feel safer, when in reality, the public setting was part of his psychological strategy to appear harmless. The psychological sophistication of Bundy's approach extended to his understanding of cognitive biases that affect human judgment and decision-making. He knew that people tend to trust individuals who seem similar to themselves, so he would research his hunting grounds to understand the local culture and adapt his presentation accordingly. On college campuses, he appeared as a fellow student. In professional settings, he presented himself as an educated professional. This psychological chameleoning allowed him to blend seamlessly into any environment he chose to hunt in. Bundy's manipulation techniques also revealed his understanding of what psychologists call authority bias, the tendency to comply with people who appeared to be in positions of authority or expertise. He would sometimes impersonate police officers or other authority figures, knowing that most people are psychologically conditioned to comply with perceived authority. This wasn't just about the uniform or badge, it was about understanding the psychological power that authority symbols hold over most people's behavior and decision-making processes in social situations. The psychology of how Bundy maintained multiple relationships simultaneously reveals the depth of his deception capabilities and emotional detachment. He was able to compartmentalize different aspects of his life so completely that people who knew him in different contexts would have difficulty believing they were describing the same person. Elizabeth Klopfer, his long-term girlfriend, lived with him for years without fully understanding his true nature. despite growing suspicions about his behavior and whereabouts during key periods. Bundy's relationship with Elizabeth Klopfer provides crucial insights into how psychopaths manage long-term deception in intimate relationships. He provided just enough genuine-seeming intimacy and connection to maintain her attachment, while carefully controlling the information she had access to. When she began to suspect something was wrong, he would alternate between charming her into doubting her instincts and gaslighting her into believing her concerns were unfounded. This pattern kept her psychologically off balance and dependent on his version of reality. The psychological technique of gaslighting that Bundy employed so effectively involves systematically undermining someone's perception of reality to maintain control over them. When Elizabeth expressed concerns about his behavior or whereabouts, he would respond with such confidence and apparent hurt at her suspicions that she would end up apologizing to him. This reversal technique is a hallmark of sophisticated psychological manipulation, making the victim feel guilty for having reasonable concerns about genuinely suspicious behavior patterns. Bundy's charm also worked effectively on law enforcement and legal professionals, which reveals how his psychological manipulation transcended typical social relationships. Even when he was suspected or arrested, his ability to present himself as reasonable and cooperative often led investigators to treat him more as a witness than a suspect. His legal knowledge and articulate manner created a psychological halo effect that made it difficult for people to see him as the monster he actually was underneath the carefully constructed facade. The psychology behind Bundy's self-representation during his trials demonstrates how he used his charm as a weapon even when facing execution. He understood that legal proceedings are psychological theater as much as they are fact-finding missions. By presenting himself as intelligent, reasonable, and even helpful to the prosecution, he was attempting to create reasonable doubt through psychological manipulation rather than evidence. His charm became his primary defense strategy against overwhelming physical evidence linking him to multiple murders. Bundy's interaction with the media reveals another dimension of his psychological manipulation that extended beyond individual relationships. He understood that journalists were looking for compelling stories and complex characters, not simple monsters. By presenting himself as thoughtful and analytical about his own crimes, he satisfied the media's need for psychological insight while maintaining control over his narrative. Even in death row interviews, he was still manipulating his audience, trying to shape how he would be remembered by future generations. The psychological analysis of Bundy's charm reveals how he weaponized fundamental human social instincts that evolved to help us cooperate and survive in groups. He exploited our tendency to trust attractive people, our desire to help those in need, our respect for authority, and our assumption that education and articulateness correlate with moral character. By understanding these psychological vulnerabilities, he was able to move through society as an apex predator disguised as an ideal citizen, using our own social programming against us. The most disturbing aspect of Bundy's psychological manipulation was how effortless it appeared to be to those who observed him in action. Unlike someone consciously acting a role, Bundy seemed to genuinely embody whatever persona he was presenting at the moment. This suggests a level of psychological dissociation where he may have been able to temporarily believe his own deceptions, making them more convincing to others. This ability to inhabit false personas completely is a hallmark of severe personality disorders and indicates profound psychological fragmentation. Understanding Bundy's charm techniques is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in other predators who use psychological manipulation as their primary weapon. The combination of physical attractiveness, apparent vulnerability, respect for social norms, and sophisticated emotional manipulation creates a psychological profile that can be extraordinarily dangerous. His case teaches us that our instincts about trustworthiness, while generally useful, can be systematically exploited by those who understand human psychology well enough to game our natural defense mechanisms and social programming. The legacy of studying Bundy's manipulation techniques has influenced modern understanding of how to recognize and resist psychological manipulation in various contexts. His case provided crucial insights into the warning signs of predatory behavior disguised as charm, helping to develop better training for law enforcement, mental health professionals, and potential victims. The psychological tools he used so effectively can be understood and defended against once we recognize them for what they are: weapons designed to exploit our humanity and basic social instincts. As we examine the full scope of Bundy's charm offensive, we see how he turned every positive human instinct into a potential vulnerability. Our desire to help others, our tendency to trust those who seem like us, our respect for authority and education, all of these became tools in his psychological arsenal. This reveals the dark side of human social evolution, showing how traits that generally help us survive and thrive in communities can be perverted by those who understand how to exploit them for predatory purposes. The psychological sophistication of Bundy's manipulation techniques rivals that of professional salespeople, politicians, and cult leaders, but with the most sinister possible applications. He understood concepts like reciprocity, social proof, authority, liking, commitment, and scarcity, the fundamental principles of persuasion, and used them to convince victims to voluntarily place themselves in mortal danger. This level of manipulation skill suggests extensive study and practice, treating human psychology like a science to be mastered for deadly purposes. Bundy's case also reveals how cultural expectations and social norms can be weaponized by those who understand them well enough. He exploited the assumption that educated, well-dressed, articulate men from good backgrounds weren't dangerous. He used society's own prejudices and biases as camouflage, understanding that people were more likely to be suspicious of someone who looked or acted different than someone who embodied their ideal of trustworthiness. This exploitation of social programming made him nearly invisible to traditional threat detection. The psychological impact of Bundy's charm extended beyond his immediate victims to include law enforcement, legal professionals, journalists, and even some family members of victims who found themselves conflicted about their feelings toward him. This widespread effect demonstrates how powerful psychological manipulation can be when applied by someone with sufficient skill and lack of moral constraints. His charm became a form of psychological weapon that affected everyone who encountered him, creating doubt and confusion even among those who should have been most suspicious. The most chilling aspect of studying Bundy's manipulation techniques is realizing how they continue to be relevant today. The psychological principles he exploited remain unchanged, and modern predators use similar techniques adapted to contemporary contexts. Understanding his methods isn't just an academic exercise, it's practical knowledge that can help protect ourselves and others from those who would exploit our better nature for the worst possible purposes. The same techniques that worked in the 1970s can be adapted to modern social media and digital communication. Bundy's charm was so effective that it fooled not just potential victims, but also trained professionals, law enforcement officers, judges, and journalists. This comprehensive deception reveals the true sophistication of his psychological manipulation and the danger posed by individuals who can weaponize normal human social responses. His ability to convince people of his harmlessness while planning their destruction represents one of the most chilling aspects of his psychological profile and demonstrates the terrifying potential of human psychology when perverted to evil purposes. The psychological techniques Bundy employed were not innate abilities, but learned skills that he developed and refined over years of practice. He studied human behavior with the dedication of a scientist, but applied his knowledge with the intentions of a predator. This deliberate cultivation of manipulation skills reveals the calculating nature of his mind and the systematic approach he took to becoming an effective killer. Every interaction was a learning opportunity, every relationship a chance to refine his techniques. The charm we've examined tonight wasn't just a personality trait, it was a carefully constructed weapon designed to disarm victims and bystanders alike. Every element of his presentation, from his physical appearance to his verbal responses, was calibrated to create maximum psychological impact and minimum suspicion. This level of deliberate deception required extraordinary mental effort and planning, revealing the true sophistication of his criminal mind and the lengths he was willing to go to perfect his predatory abilities. Understanding how Bundy's charm worked helps us recognize that our normal social instincts, while generally protective, can be exploited by those who understand psychology well enough to game our natural responses. His case teaches us to maintain healthy skepticism even when dealing with seemingly trustworthy individuals, especially those who seem too good to be true or who trigger our helping instincts in ways that create vulnerability. The goal isn't to become paranoid, but to maintain awareness that predators can be extraordinarily skilled at appearing harmless. The psychological manipulation techniques we've explored tonight represent a darkened version of normal social skills, where healthy individuals develop charm and persuasion abilities to build genuine relationships and achieve legitimate goals. Bundy developed these same skills to exploit, control, and ultimately destroy other human beings. This perversion of normal social development reveals how personality disorders can corrupt even the most basic human capacities for connection and communication, turning tools of cooperation into weapons of predation. As we continue our psychological journey into Ted Bundy's mind, this understanding of his manipulation techniques provides the foundation for exploring how he used these skills to hunt, capture, and control his victims. The charm was just the beginning. It was the key that unlocked access to the vulnerable people he would ultimately destroy. The master manipulator we've examined was ready to put his psychological weapons to their most deadly use, transforming social skills into tools of terror. The pleasant mask had a mind that viewed other human beings not as people, but as objects to be manipulated, controlled, and ultimately destroyed. Every technique he mastered, every psychological principle he understood, every aspect of his carefully crafted charm was ultimately designed to serve one purpose: gaining access to victims and satisfying his growing psychological need for control, domination, and ultimately, murder. The weapon was perfected and ready to be deployed against innocent victims who would never see it coming. As our psychological exploration of Ted Bundy continues, we now examine the crucial transition from disturbed individual to active killer. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual psychological escalation that reveals how fantasy can evolve into reality when combined with opportunity and deteriorating psychological controls. Understanding this development process is essential for recognizing how seemingly manageable psychological disturbances can evolve into catastrophic violence when left unchecked and allowed to progress without intervention or recognition of the warning signs. The psychological bridge between Bundy's adolescent antisocial behavior and his adult crimes was built through an escalating pattern of what experts call rehearsal behaviors. These are actions that don't constitute full crimes, but serve as psychological practice for more serious offenses. In Bundy's case, these included voyeurism, stalking, and what he later described as hunting expeditions, where he would follow women without attacking them, studying their routines and vulnerabilities while building his confidence and refining his techniques for future use. The psychology of rehearsal behaviors reveals how sexual predators often spend months or years building toward their first serious offense through increasingly invasive actions. For Bundy, these preparatory activities served multiple psychological functions. They allowed him to refine his techniques, build confidence in his ability to evade detection, and gradually desensitize himself to increasingly predatory behavior. Each successful stalking episode reinforced his sense of power and control while moving him psychologically closer to actual violence against innocent victims. Bundy's first confirmed kill is believed to have occurred in 1974. though he may have been responsible for earlier crimes that remain unsolved due to his sophisticated methods and geographic mobility. The psychological significance of this first murder cannot be overstated. It represented the moment when his violent fantasies crossed the threshold into reality. Research shows that for serial killers, the first murder is often the most psychologically significant because it breaks down the final barrier between imagination and action, fundamentally changing their relationship with violence. The psychology of Bundy's victim selection reveals sophisticated predatory thinking that had clearly been developing for years before his first known attack. He didn't choose victims randomly or opportunistically. He selected young women who fit specific psychological and physical criteria that fed into his developing fantasy system. Most were attractive, intelligent college students with long, dark hair parted in the middle, similar to his college girlfriend Stephanie Brooks, who had rejected him years earlier and traumatized his narcissistic self-image in ways that would echo throughout his criminal career. The geographical pattern of Bundy's early crimes reveals psychological comfort zones and escalating confidence in his criminal abilities. He began hunting close to familiar areas near the University of Washington, where he had been a student, in neighborhoods he knew well, and among populations he understood. This geographical progression from familiar to unfamiliar territory is common among serial killers and reflects growing psychological confidence in their ability to evade capture and successfully complete their crimes without detection by law enforcement or witnesses. Bundy's method of approach during his early crimes demonstrates the practical application of the manipulation techniques he had been developing for years. The injured man routine with fake casts and crutches wasn't improvised. It was a carefully tested psychological strategy designed to trigger helping behavior while creating a plausible reason for victims to accompany him to his vehicle. The psychological sophistication of this approach shows he understood that successful predation required more than just opportunity. It required psychological manipulation to overcome natural caution. The psychology behind Bundy's use of deception rather than force in victim acquisition reveals important aspects of his mental state and self-image. Unlike disorganized killers who rely on surprise attacks or overwhelming force, Bundy preferred psychological manipulation because it gave him a sense of intellectual superiority over his victims. The fact that he could convince them to come with him voluntarily fed into his narcissistic self-image as someone who was smarter and more sophisticated than both his victims and law enforcement. This need for intellectual dominance was central to his psychology. The escalation pattern in Bundy's early crimes shows classic signs of what psychologists call behavioral shaping, the gradual refinement of techniques through experience and feedback. His first attacks were likely more impulsive and less carefully planned, but as he gained experience and confidence, his methods became increasingly sophisticated. He learned from each crime, adapting his approach based on what worked and what didn't, treating murder as a skill to be perfected rather than isolated acts of violence driven by uncontrollable impulses. The psychological analysis of Bundy's post-crime behavior reveals important insights into his mental state and the absence of normal emotional responses. Unlike killers who are consumed by guilt or fear after their first murder, Bundy appeared to experience psychological satisfaction and increased confidence. He continued his normal social and professional activities without displaying obvious signs of distress, which demonstrates the profound emotional detachment characteristic of psychopathy and his ability to compartmentalize his actions completely from his daily life. Bundy's ability to maintain his normal life while committing increasingly frequent murders reveals extraordinary psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to function in multiple roles simultaneously. He could attend law school, maintain romantic relationships, and participate in political activities while simultaneously planning and executing brutal murders. This level of compartmentalization requires not just the absence of normal emotional responses, but active psychological mechanisms to keep different aspects of his life completely separate and isolated from each other. The frequency escalation in Bundy's crimes reflects the psychology of addiction, like behavior patterns that become increasingly demanding over time. Like other compulsive behaviors, Killing appeared to provide temporary psychological satisfaction that diminished over time, requiring increasingly frequent incidents to achieve the same level of gratification. This escalation pattern is common among serial killers and reflects the underlying psychological needs that drive their behavior, becoming more demanding and harder to satisfy through normal means. The geographic expansion of Bundy's crimes reveals growing psychological confidence and possibly boredom with familiar hunting grounds as his success rate increased. As his comfort level increased, he began traveling to other states, expanding his operational area and increasing the complexity of his crimes. This geographic escalation also served practical purposes. It made investigation more difficult by involving multiple jurisdictions and reducing the likelihood of pattern recognition by law enforcement agencies working independently. Bundy's evolving crime scene behavior provides insights into his psychological development as a killer and his growing sophistication in all aspects of his crimes. Early crimes showed signs of experimentation and uncertainty, but later crimes demonstrated increasing sophistication in victim control, evidence destruction, and body disposal. This learning curve reveals how he was treating murder as a skill to be perfected rather than isolated acts of violence, approaching killing with the same methodical improvement he brought to other areas of his life. The psychological significance of Bundy's trophy-taking behavior emerged during this period as another way to extend the psychological gratification from his crimes. He began keeping personal items from victims, photographing crime scenes, and returning to disposal sites to interact with remains. These behaviors serve multiple psychological functions for serial killers. They extend the psychological gratification from the crime, provide material for fantasy reinforcement, and create a sense of continued connection to and control over victims even after death. Bundy's development of what he called his possession of victims reveals the underlying psychological motivation for his crimes that went beyond simple violence. He wasn't just killing for the act of murder itself, he was seeking to achieve total control and ownership of another human being. This possessiveness extended beyond death, as evidenced by his necrophilic behavior and his tendency to revisit disposal sites long after the murders to continue interacting with his victims in ways that satisfied his psychological needs for dominance and control. The psychology of Bundy's necrophilic behavior represents the ultimate expression of his need for complete control and dominance over another person. With living victims, there was always the possibility of resistance, escape, or unpredictability that could threaten his sense of control. With dead victims, he achieved the total domination and possession that his psychological needs required. This behavior also allowed him to extend the time frame of his crimes, extracting additional gratification from each victim long after the initial murder had been completed. The escalation in violence and sadism during Bundy's early killing period reveals the deteriorating effectiveness of his psychological coping mechanisms and the increasing demands of his pathology. As the psychological satisfaction from each murder diminished, he required increasingly extreme behavior to achieve the same level of gratification. This escalation pattern is characteristic of addictive behaviors and suggests that his psychological needs were intensifying rather than being satisfied by his crimes, creating an ever-increasing cycle of violence and degradation. Bundy's increasing boldness during this period, attacking multiple victims in a single day, taking victims from increasingly public locations, and engaging in riskier behavior reflects both growing confidence and possibly deteriorating judgment. The psychological high from successful crimes may have led to overconfidence and risk-taking that would eventually contribute to his capture, as his need for stimulation overcame his normally careful approach to avoiding detection. This pattern of escalating risk-taking is common among serial killers who become addicted to the thrill. The development of Bundy's signature behaviors during this period reveals how his psychological needs were crystallizing into consistent patterns that would remain relatively stable throughout his criminal career. The type of victim, the method of approach, the location preferences, and the post-crime behavior all became increasingly standardized, reflecting the psychological template that drove his crimes. These signatures were expressions of his core psychological needs and remained remarkably consistent throughout his killing career, providing investigators with patterns to analyze. Understanding the psychological escalation pattern in Bundy's early crimes provides crucial insights into how serial killers develop and refine their methods over time. His case demonstrates how initial success can feed psychological needs while simultaneously creating tolerance that requires escalation. The combination of psychopathic traits, narcissistic needs, and addiction-like behavioral patterns created a psychological system that demanded increasingly frequent and extreme crimes to maintain psychological equilibrium, making it virtually impossible for him to stop once he had started. The transformation from fantasy to reality that we see in Bundy's early crimes represents one of the most dangerous transitions in criminal psychology. Once the barrier between imagination and action is broken, the psychological restraints that keep most people from acting on violent thoughts are permanently damaged. This transition point is crucial for understanding how individuals move from having disturbing thoughts to committing actual crimes, and it highlights the importance of intervention before this critical threshold is crossed and the individual becomes a danger to society. As we examine this developmental period in Bundy's criminal career, we see how each successful crime built upon the previous ones, creating a psychological momentum that became increasingly difficult to stop. The satisfaction he derived from his early successes created positive reinforcement for his criminal behavior, while the absence of negative consequences reinforced his belief that he was too smart and too careful to ever be caught by law enforcement. This confidence would prove to be both his greatest asset and ultimately his downfall. The psychological analysis of this period also reveals how Bundy's crimes served multiple functions beyond simple violence. They satisfied his need for control and dominance, fed his narcissistic fantasies of superiority, provided outlets for his sexual sadism, and created a sense of meaning and purpose in his life that he couldn't find through legitimate activities. This multifunctional nature of his crimes made them particularly addictive and difficult to stop once they began, as they were meeting so many of his psychological needs simultaneously. The early crime period we've examined tonight established the psychological template that would guide all of Bundy's subsequent criminal behavior. The patterns developed during this time, the victim selection criteria, the approach methods, the crime scene behavior, and the post-crime activities would remain remarkably consistent throughout his career, demonstrating how deeply ingrained these psychological patterns had become in his mental framework. Understanding this template helps us recognize similar patterns in other predators. As we continue our exploration of Bundy's psychology, this understanding of his developmental period as a killer provides the foundation for examining his most prolific and brutal phase. The psychological patterns established during these early crimes would shape everything that followed, creating a template for violence that would ultimately claim dozens of lives across multiple states and establish Ted Bundy as one of history's most notorious and psychologically complex serial killers. The monster was fully formed. The techniques were refined, the psychological needs were crystallized into consistent patterns, and across the Pacific Northwest, young women continued their daily lives, completely unaware that a predator was among them, a predator who had perfected the art of appearing harmless while harboring the most deadly intentions. The early crimes were just the beginning of a psychological journey into darkness that would shock the nation and forever change how we understand criminal psychology. The transformation we've examined tonight reveals how a combination of psychological factors, narcissistic injury, sexual sadism, and the need for control can create a perfect storm of violence when combined with intelligence and sophisticated social skills. Bundy's early crimes weren't random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated expressions of his deepest psychological needs, refined through practice until they became a deadly art form that would terrorize multiple states. Understanding this developmental process is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in other individuals before they cross the threshold from fantasy to reality. The warning signs we've examined, the escalating rehearsal behaviors, the sophisticated planning, the psychological compartmentalization can help identify potential predators before they claim their first victim. The psychology of evil may be complex, but it follows recognizable patterns that can be understood and potentially interrupted. The foundation had been laid, the skills had been developed, and the psychological template had been established. Ted Bundy had completed his transformation from troubled individual to sophisticated predator, and he was ready to begin the most prolific and terrifying phase of his criminal career. The early crimes we've examined were merely the opening act in a drama of violence that would claim dozens of innocent lives and shock the nation. As we delve deeper into the psychological landscape of Ted Bundy's mind, we now examine perhaps the most chilling aspect of his pathology: the systematic, almost scientific approach he took to hunting human beings. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion, but carefully calculated predation based on sophisticated psychological understanding of human vulnerability. By analyzing Bundy's hunting patterns, we gain disturbing insights into how predators identify, target, and capture their victims through methodical exploitation of human psychology and social conditioning. The psychology of Bundy's victim selection reveals a level of planning and specificity that goes far beyond opportunity or convenience alone. His victims weren't chosen randomly, they were selected based on a complex psychological template that served multiple needs in his twisted mental landscape. Understanding this template helps us recognize how predators think and potentially identify vulnerable situations before they become dangerous. The specificity of his targeting reveals the depth of his psychological pathology and the calculated nature of his crimes. The most obvious pattern in Bundy's victim selection was physical appearance. The majority of his victims were young women in their late teens or early 20s, attractive, with long dark hair parted in the middle. This specificity wasn't coincidental, it reflected a psychological fixation that traced back to his traumatic relationship with Stephanie Brooks, the college girlfriend who had rejected him. In a psychological sense, Bundy was killing the same woman over and over again, working through his narcissistic injury by destroying symbolic representations of the person who had wounded his ego. The psychological significance of this physical template reveals how personal trauma can become integrated into criminal fantasy systems. Bundy's victims weren't just random targets, they were psychological substitutes for someone who had caused him emotional pain. This pattern of symbolic killing is common among serial killers who have experienced significant rejection or trauma in their past. The victims become surrogates for the original source of psychological injury, allowing the killer to repeatedly reenact and resolve their trauma through violence. Beyond physical appearance, Bundy's victims shared other important characteristics that reveal his psychological hunting criteria. Most were college students or young professionals, intelligent, ambitious women who represented success and social acceptance. This targeting pattern suggests that Bundy was drawn to victims who embodied qualities he admired but felt he couldn't legitimately possess or access. By destroying these women, he was symbolically destroying the social world that he felt had rejected him. The psychology of targeting successful, intelligent women also reveals Bundy's need to prove his superiority over those he perceived as his social betters. These weren't easy targets, they were smart, educated, and socially aware. The fact that he could manipulate and destroy them fed into his narcissistic fantasy of being intellectually superior to everyone around him. Each successful attack reinforced his grandiose self-image and validated his belief that he was smarter than both his victims and law enforcement. Bundy's hunting grounds reveal sophisticated understanding of predator-prey dynamics and environmental psychology. He favored locations where his target demographic would naturally congregate: college campuses, universities, and areas frequented by young, educated women. This wasn't random hunting but strategic positioning in environments where he could study potential victims, learn their routines, and identify vulnerabilities. His familiarity with these environments allowed him to blend in while conducting surveillance. The psychological analysis of Bundy's approach methods reveals a predator who understood that successful hunting required more than just opportunity, it required psychological manipulation to overcome natural caution. His fake injury routine was psychologically brilliant because it exploited multiple human instincts simultaneously. The desire to help those in need, the assumption that injured people aren't dangerous, and the social conditioning that teaches us to trust authority figures and educated individuals. The timing of Bundy's attacks reveals sophisticated understanding of when potential victims would be most vulnerable. He often struck during transitions when women were leaving one location for another, during evening hours when visibility was reduced, or during periods when they might be distracted or hurried. This timing strategy demonstrates his understanding that vulnerability isn't just about physical isolation but also about psychological states that reduce awareness and decision-making capacity. Bundy's geographical expansion patterns reveal the psychology of a predator who is both cautious and ambitious. He began hunting in familiar territory where he understood the local culture, law enforcement patterns, and escape routes. As his confidence grew, he expanded to new states and regions, always maintaining the strategic advantage of superior local knowledge. This expansion pattern shows how successful predators can operate across large geographical areas while maintaining psychological comfort zones. The psychology of Bundy's victim approach reveals sophisticated understanding of social engineering and human psychology. He studied how to present himself as non-threatening, helpful, and trustworthy. His ability to read people quickly and adjust his approach accordingly shows advanced social intelligence perverted to predatory purposes. He could assess a potential victim's personality type and tailor his manipulation accordingly, demonstrating the calculating nature of his hunting methodology. Bundy's use of props and costumes reveals the theatrical nature of his predation. The fake casts, crutches, and authority figure impersonations weren't just disguises, they were psychological tools designed to trigger specific responses in his targets. Each prop was carefully chosen to create a particular impression and overcome specific types of resistance. This level of planning shows how he treated each approach as a performance designed to achieve a specific psychological effect. The psychology of how Bundy handled rejection or failed approaches reveals important aspects of his mental state. When potential victims didn't respond to his initial approach, he would typically withdraw rather than persist, showing he understood that drawing attention to himself was counterproductive. This restraint demonstrates his ability to prioritize long-term goals over immediate gratification, a characteristic that made him particularly dangerous because it showed sophisticated impulse control. Bundy's victim acquisition often involved what psychologists call compliance techniques, methods of gradually increasing commitment that make it harder for targets to refuse or escape. He would start with small requests for help, then escalate to larger requests that required the victim to accompany him to his vehicle. This graduated approach exploited the psychological principle of consistency. Once someone agrees to help, they're more likely to continue helping even when the requests become more demanding. The psychological analysis of Bundy's hunting reveals how he exploited social scripts and expected behaviors. He understood that in certain social situations, people follow predictable patterns of behavior. By inserting himself into these scripts as a harmless character in need of help, he could manipulate people into following familiar social routines that ultimately led them into danger. This shows sophisticated understanding of social psychology and human behavioral patterns. Bundy's ability to hunt successfully across different geographical regions reveals psychological adaptability that made him particularly dangerous. He could quickly assess local customs, social norms, and behavioral patterns, then adjust his hunting strategy accordingly. This chameleon-like ability to blend into different social environments while maintaining his predatory focus demonstrates the sophisticated nature of his psychological makeup and criminal methodology. The psychology of Bundy's victim transportation reveals planning that went far beyond the initial capture. He had carefully thought through how to control victims once they were in his vehicle, how to prevent escape attempts, and how to maintain psychological dominance throughout the abduction process. This level of planning shows he had mentally rehearsed every aspect of his crimes long before executing them. Bundy's hunting patterns reveal understanding of law enforcement procedures and investigative limitations. He chose victims and locations that would make investigation difficult, targeting people who might not be immediately missed, operating across jurisdictional boundaries, and avoiding patterns that would be easy for investigators to recognize. This shows he was thinking not just about capturing victims, but about evading capture himself. The psychology of how Bundy selected specific individuals from his target demographic reveals even deeper levels of calculation. He looked for women who appeared to be alone, who seemed distracted or preoccupied, or who displayed body language suggesting they might be receptive to requests for help. This ability to quickly assess vulnerability shows sophisticated understanding of human psychology and predatory instincts honed through extensive observation and practice. Bundy's hunting methodology reveals how he used legitimate social interactions as cover for predatory behavior. His approaches often occurred in broad daylight in public places, making them appear completely normal to any observers. This psychological camouflage allowed him to conduct predatory activities while appearing to engage in normal social interactions, demonstrating his understanding of how to hide criminal behavior within acceptable social frameworks. The temporal patterns of Bundy's hunting reveal psychological needs that went beyond simple opportunity. He often hunted during periods of high stress in his personal life or when he felt his carefully constructed public image was being threatened. This suggests that hunting and killing serve psychological functions related to stress relief and ego restoration, making his crimes as much about internal psychological needs as external circumstances. Bundy's victim selection process also reveals how he balanced psychological needs with practical considerations. While his victims fit specific psychological criteria related to his personal trauma and fantasies, he also selected targets based on practical factors like availability, vulnerability, and low risk of detection. This balance between psychology and pragmatism shows the sophisticated nature of his criminal planning and execution. The psychology of Bundy's hunting reveals how he treated potential victims as objects to be evaluated rather than human beings to be respected. His ability to observe women for extended periods while planning their destruction shows the complete emotional detachment characteristic of psychopathy. He could study their routines, assess their vulnerabilities, and plan their murders while maintaining a pleasant social facade. Bundy's hunting patterns reveal understanding of psychological manipulation at both individual and societal levels. He exploited not just individual psychology, but cultural assumptions about gender roles, social class, and trustworthiness. His success depended on understanding how society conditions people to respond to certain types of requests and presentations, allowing him to weaponize social programming for predatory purposes. The evolutionary psychology aspects of Bundy's hunting reveal how he perverted natural human instincts for cooperation and mutual aid. His fake injury routine exploited evolutionary programming that encourages helping behavior toward those who appear vulnerable or in need. This shows how sophisticated predators can weaponize the very instincts that make human society possible, turning our capacity for compassion into vulnerabilities to be exploited. Understanding Bundy's hunting psychology is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in other predators and developing better protective strategies. His methods reveal that successful predation often relies more on psychological manipulation than physical force, and that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal and trustworthy. His case teaches us that threat assessment must consider psychological sophistication, not just obvious dangerous behavior. The hunting methodology we've examined tonight reveals a predator who combined advanced psychological understanding with complete moral detachment to create one of the most effective killing machines in criminal history. His ability to identify, approach, and capture victims while maintaining his cover as a respectable member of society demonstrates the terrifying potential of human intelligence when divorced from empathy and moral constraint. The systematic nature of Bundy's hunting reveals how he transformed predation into a science, treating human beings as subjects for study and experimentation rather than people deserving of respect and protection. This objectification of victims is a crucial component of his psychology and helps explain how he could commit such horrific acts while maintaining his public facade as a charming, educated, and successful individual. As we continue our exploration of Bundy's psychology, understanding his hunting methodology provides crucial context for examining his most violent and prolific periods. The skills and techniques we've analyzed tonight would be refined and intensified as his killing career progressed, leading to increasingly sophisticated and deadly applications of his predatory psychology against innocent victims who never had a chance to recognize the danger they faced. The hunter we've examined tonight was a master of psychological manipulation who could identify and exploit human vulnerability with scientific precision. His success as a predator depended not on obvious strength or aggression, but on his ability to appear harmless while harboring the most deadly intentions. Understanding how this psychological weapon operated helps us recognize similar patterns and potentially protect future victims from those who would exploit human kindness for evil purposes. The predatory patterns we've analyzed reveal the full horror of what Ted Bundy had become, not just a killer, but a sophisticated predator who had mastered the art of psychological manipulation to a degree that made him nearly invisible to traditional threat detection. His hunting methodology represents the dark evolution of human intelligence applied to the most evil possible purposes, creating a monster who could walk among us undetected while planning our destruction. As we continue our psychological journey into the depths of Ted Bundy's mind, we now explore perhaps the most fundamental driving force behind his crimes and insatiable need for control and dominance over other human beings. This wasn't simply about violence or sexual gratification, but about achieving total psychological and physical power over his victims. Understanding this core motivation helps us comprehend how Bundy's crimes escalated in both frequency and brutality as his need for control became an all-consuming psychological obsession that could never be truly satisfied. The psychology of control needs in antisocial personalities reveals patterns that go far beyond normal human desires for autonomy and influence. For individuals like Bundy, control becomes the primary organizing principle of their psychological life, driving all behaviors and relationships toward the goal of domination. This need stems from deep-seated feelings of powerlessness and inadequacy that must be constantly countered through demonstrations of superiority over others, creating a psychological cycle that demands ever-increasing levels of control to maintain equilibrium. Bundy's need for control manifested first in his manipulation of social situations and relationships, but gradually escalated to require physical dominance and ultimately life and death power over his victims. The progression from psychological manipulation to physical violence represents the natural evolution of control needs that can't be satisfied through normal social interactions. As his tolerance for normal forms of control increased, he required increasingly extreme demonstrations of power to achieve the same psychological satisfaction. The psychological roots of Bundy's control obsession can be traced to his early experiences of powerlessness and deception. Growing up, believing lies about his parentage, being moved between families, and experiencing rejection in his first serious relationship all contributed to feelings of being controlled by others rather than being in control himself. These early experiences created a psychological template where control became associated with safety, self-worth, and identity, making the pursuit of dominance a survival mechanism. Bundy's approach to victim selection reveals how his need for control influenced every aspect of his criminal behavior. He chose victims who appeared vulnerable but were actually strong and intelligent, creating a psychological dynamic where overcoming their resistance would provide maximum satisfaction. The fact that his victims were capable, educated women made their ultimate submission to his will even more psychologically rewarding, feeding his grandiose self-image as someone capable of dominating anyone. The psychology of Bundy's crime methodology shows how control needs shaped his entire approach to murder. Rather than killing quickly, he often kept victims alive for extended periods, savoring the psychological and physical dominance he could exercise over them. This prolonged control phase was often more psychologically important to him than the actual killing, as it allowed him to experience the total power over another human being that his psychology craved. Bundy's evolution from using deception to capture victims to using force reveals escalating control needs that couldn't be satisfied through manipulation alone. While his early crimes relied heavily on psychological manipulation to gain victim compliance, later crimes showed increasing use of physical restraints, weapons, and direct intimidation. This escalation demonstrates how control obsessions tend to intensify over time, requiring more extreme measures to achieve the same psychological satisfaction. The psychological significance of Bundy's torture and sadistic behaviors reveals control needs taken to their ultimate expression. Physical and psychological torture allowed him to experience absolute power over his victims' pain, fear, and hope. This level of control went beyond what could be achieved through simple murder, providing him with godlike power over every aspect of his victims' experience during their final hours. The sadistic elements of his crimes were expressions of control rather than simple cruelty. Bundy's necrophilic behavior represents the ultimate expression of his control psychology with dead victims. He achieved perfect dominance without any possibility of resistance or unpredictability. The deceased could not refuse his advances, escape his control, or challenge his authority in any way. This complete possession satisfied his control needs in ways that living victims, with their capacity for resistance and independence, never could. Death became the ultimate form of ownership for his twisted psychology. The psychology of how Bundy managed multiple victims during his most violent period reveals sophisticated control strategies adapted to complex situations. When he abducted multiple victims simultaneously, he demonstrated advanced understanding of dominance hierarchies and psychological manipulation techniques needed to control more than one person at a time. This escalation shows his growing confidence in his ability to exercise total control over increasingly challenging situations. Bundy's ritualistic behaviors around his crimes reveal how control needs became codified into specific psychological patterns that must be followed to achieve satisfaction. The consistent elements of his crimes-specific victim types, particular approaches, certain post-murder behaviors represented a ritualized expression of his control psychology. These rituals weren't random but were psychologically necessary components of his dominance fantasy system. The geographic expansion of Bundy's crimes reveals control needs that extended beyond individual victims to encompass entire regions and communities. By operating across multiple states and jurisdictions, he was asserting dominance not just over individual victims, but over law enforcement agencies and entire populations. This territorial expansion represents a psychological need to control ever larger spheres of influence, treating entire geographic regions as domains of his power. Bundy's interaction with law enforcement after his capture reveals how his control needs persisted even in custody. His demands for special treatment, his manipulation of legal proceedings, and his attempts to control media coverage all demonstrate the continuation of his dominance psychology even when his freedom was restricted. He treated the legal system as another arena where he could exercise psychological control and demonstrate his superiority over others. The psychology of Bundy's confessions reveals control needs that influenced even how he revealed information about his crimes. He parceled out details strategically, using information as a tool to manipulate investigators, attorneys, and journalists. Even when facing execution, he maintained psychological control by determining what information would be revealed and when, treating his confessions as final demonstrations of his power over the investigation process. Bundy's relationships with women throughout his life reveal consistent patterns of control and dominance that preceded his criminal career. Even in seemingly normal relationships, he demonstrated needs to manipulate, deceive, and maintain psychological power over his partners. These relationship patterns provided early templates for the more extreme control he would later exercise over his victims, showing how normal relationship dynamics can be perverted by pathological control needs. The psychological analysis of Bundy's work and academic life reveals how control needs manifested in legitimate contexts before evolving into criminal behavior. His political involvement, legal studies, and professional activities all provided outlets for influence and manipulation that satisfied some of his control needs. However, these legitimate outlets proved insufficient to satisfy his escalating psychological requirements, leading to the search for more extreme forms of dominance. Bundy's fantasy life, as revealed through his own statements and psychological analysis, centered entirely around scenarios of complete control and dominance over others. These fantasies served as psychological rehearsals for his actual crimes, allowing him to experience control in imagination before seeking it in reality. The evolution of his fantasy life from relatively mild scenarios to extremely violent ones parallels the escalation of his actual criminal behavior. The psychology of how Bundy experienced psychological satisfaction from his crimes reveals control as the primary rewarding element, rather than violence itself. He described feeling most fulfilled during moments when he had complete power over his victims, when they were entirely dependent on his will for their continued existence. This psychological high from absolute control became addictive, requiring increasingly frequent and extreme crimes to achieve the same level of satisfaction. Bundy's trophy-taking behavior reveals control needs that extended beyond the actual crime to include ongoing possession of symbols representing his dominance. Personal items from victims, photographs of crime scenes, and visits to disposal sites all allowed him to re-experience the control he had exercised during the crimes. These behaviors show how control obsessions can persist long after the actual exercise of power, requiring ongoing reinforcement through symbolic possession. The psychological comparison between Bundy's need for control and normal human autonomy drives reveals the pathological nature of his psychology. While all humans have needs for some control over their environment and circumstances, Bundy's needs were quantitatively and qualitatively different, requiring absolute dominance over others rather than simple personal autonomy. This distinction helps explain why normal outlets for control and influence couldn't satisfy his psychological requirements. Bundy's manipulation of his public image reveals control needs that extended to his reputation and legacy. He carefully managed how he was perceived by media, law enforcement, and the public, treating his image as another domain where he could exercise control. This ongoing manipulation of perception shows how his control psychology extended to every aspect of his existence, including how he would be remembered after death. The escalation of violence in Bundy's crimes reflects control needs that became increasingly difficult to satisfy through conventional means. As his tolerance for normal forms of control increased, he required more extreme demonstrations of power to achieve psychological satisfaction. This escalation pattern is characteristic of control-obsessed personalities and helps explain why his crimes became progressively more brutal and frequent over time. Bundy's treatment of law enforcement as adversaries in a psychological game reveals control needs that transformed even investigation efforts into opportunities for dominance. He appeared to enjoy the cat-and-mouse dynamic with investigators, treating their efforts to catch him as validation of his superior intelligence and control abilities. This adversarial relationship satisfied his needs for intellectual dominance and reinforced his grandiose self-image. The psychology of Bundy's final period before execution reveals control needs that persisted even when facing death. His manipulation of interview processes, strategic revelation of information, and attempts to control his execution timeline all demonstrate the continuation of his dominant psychology until the very end. Even facing ultimate powerlessness, he sought ways to exercise psychological control over his circumstances and the people around him. Understanding Bundy's control psychology helps explain the particular horror of his crimes and the lasting impact they had on society. His need for dominance wasn't satisfied by conventional success or achievement, but required the ultimate expression of power control over life and death itself. This psychology created a predator who couldn't be satisfied through normal means and who would continue escalating until stopped by external force. The control patterns we've examined tonight reveal how pathological needs for dominance can escalate from normal relationship manipulation to extreme criminal violence. Bundy's case shows how control obsessions can become all-consuming psychological forces that drive individuals to seek ever greater expressions of power over others. Understanding these patterns helps us recognize similar psychology in others before it escalates to violence. The need for control that we've analyzed represents one of the most dangerous psychological patterns in criminal behavior because it's never truly satisfiable. Unlike other criminal motivations that might be addressed through specific interventions, control obsessions tend to escalate continuously, requiring increasingly extreme expressions to achieve psychological satisfaction. This makes individuals with these patterns particularly dangerous and difficult to rehabilitate or redirect. Bundy's control psychology reveals how intelligence and sophistication can be perverted to serve pathological ends. His advanced understanding of human psychology and social dynamics made him more effective at exercising control, but also made his need for dominance more dangerous. The combination of high intelligence with pathological control needs created a predator capable of sophisticated and sustained criminal campaigns. The ultimate expression of Bundy's control needs, the power of life and death over his victims, represents the most extreme form of human dominance possible. This level of control satisfied psychological needs that couldn't be met through any legitimate means, creating a situation where continued criminal escalation was virtually inevitable. Understanding this psychology helps explain why some individuals progress from minor antisocial behavior to extreme violence. As we continue our exploration of Bundy's psychology, understanding his control needs provides crucial context for examining his most violent and prolific periods. The patterns we've analyzed tonight would drive him to seek increasingly extreme expressions of dominance, leading to the brutal crimes that would ultimately define his legacy and shock the conscience of the nation. The psychology of control we've examined reveals Ted Bundy not just as a killer, but as someone whose entire psychological existence was organized around the need for dominance over others. This core drive shaped every aspect of his criminal career and helps explain both the particular nature of his crimes and the escalating pattern that characterized his killing spree. Understanding this fundamental motivation is key to comprehending the full horror of what he became. As our psychological exploration of Ted Bundy continues, we now examine how his killing spree expanded across multiple states, creating a reign of terror that stretched from Washington to Florida. This geographic expansion wasn't random wandering, but reflected sophisticated psychological planning and escalating confidence in his abilities. Understanding the psychology behind Bundy's multi-state crimes reveals how his need for control and dominance evolved to encompass entire regions, while his growing boldness led to increasingly risky behavior that would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The psychology of geographic expansion in serial killing reveals patterns of increasing confidence and sophistication that often characterize successful predators. For Bundy, moving beyond his original hunting grounds in Washington represented a psychological evolution from local predator to what he perceived as a national threat. This expansion fed his grandiose self-image while providing practical benefits, including reduced law enforcement coordination and decreased likelihood of pattern recognition across jurisdictional boundaries. Bundy's move from Washington to Utah in 1974 marked the beginning of his multi-state killing career and reflected both personal circumstances and psychological needs. His enrollment in law school at the University of Utah provided legitimate cover for relocation while placing him in a new hunting ground filled with potential victims. The psychological significance of choosing a law school environment reveals his growing confidence and his desire to operate in settings where his intelligence and social skills would provide maximum advantage. The psychology behind Bundy's victim selection in Utah reveals consistent patterns despite the geographic change. He continued targeting young, attractive women with long dark hair, demonstrating that his core psychological needs remained constant even as his operational environment changed. The consistency of his victim profile across different states shows how deeply ingrained his fantasy template had become and how geographic mobility didn't alter his fundamental psychological drives. Bundy's Utah crimes showed increasing sophistication in planning and execution, reflecting his growing experience and confidence as a predator. The abduction of Carol Durant, who became his first known survivor, reveals both his evolving techniques and the increasing risks he was willing to take. His impersonation of a police officer to gain victim compliance shows psychological adaptation to new environments while maintaining his core strategy of using authority and deception to overcome resistance. The psychological analysis of Bundy's failed abduction attempt with Carol Durant reveals important insights into his mental state during this period. His ability to maintain composure and continue his charade even when the victim became suspicious demonstrates remarkable psychological control under pressure. However, his decision to persist with the abduction attempt despite clear signs of victim resistance shows growing overconfidence that would eventually contribute to his capture. Bundy's expansion into Colorado reflects escalating psychological needs that required increasingly challenging hunting grounds to provide adequate stimulation. Colorado's ski resort areas attracted exactly the type of victims he preferred while providing new environmental challenges that satisfied his need for intellectual stimulation. The psychology of seeking more challenging hunting environments is common among sophisticated predators who become bored with familiar territory and methods. The abduction and murder of Karen Campbell from a crowded ski resort demonstrates Bundy's growing boldness and his psychological need to prove his superiority in increasingly difficult situations. Taking a victim from a location filled with potential witnesses required extraordinary confidence and sophisticated planning. This escalation shows how his psychological needs for control and dominance were driving him toward increasingly risky behavior. Bundy's crimes in Colorado revealed evolving signature behaviors that reflected his growing psychological sophistication and sadistic needs. The increased level of violence and the extended periods he kept victims alive show how his control needs were intensifying and requiring more extreme expressions. The psychology behind these escalating behaviors reveals a predator whose tolerance for normal levels of dominance was diminishing, requiring increasingly extreme acts to achieve satisfaction. The psychological significance of Bundy's geographic knowledge and preparation becomes evident in his ability to operate successfully across multiple mountain states. His understanding of local terrain, escape routes, and body disposal sites shows extensive research and planning that goes far beyond opportunistic killing. This level of preparation reveals a predator who treated each new geographic area as a strategic challenge requiring systematic study and careful execution. Bundy's ability to maintain his normal social and academic life while conducting a multi-state killing spree reveals extraordinary psychological compartmentalization. He continued attending law school, maintaining romantic relationships, and participating in social activities while simultaneously planning and executing brutal murders across several states. This level of psychological splitting shows the sophisticated nature of his mental organization and his ability to function in multiple realities simultaneously. The psychology of Bundy's return to Washington for the Lake Sammamish attacks reveals how geographic familiarity could provide psychological comfort during periods of high stress. Operating in familiar territory allowed him to take unprecedented risks, including attacking multiple victims in broad daylight from a crowded public location. This return to familiar hunting grounds shows how psychological comfort zones can enable escalating criminal behavior. The Lake Sammamish attacks represent a psychological turning point where Bundy's need for stimulation overcame his normally careful approach to risk management. Approaching victims in broad daylight using his real name shows either extreme overconfidence or deteriorating judgment. The psychology behind this dramatic escalation in risk-taking reveals how success can lead to overconfidence that ultimately proves self-destructive. Bundy's capture in Utah and subsequent legal proceedings reveal how his multi-state activities had created a web of evidence that eventually entrapped him. The psychology of his behavior during legal proceedings shows his continued attempts to maintain control even when facing overwhelming evidence. His decision to represent himself in court reflects his narcissistic belief that his intelligence could overcome the accumulated evidence from his multi-state crimes. The psychological analysis of Bundy's escape from Colorado custody reveals planning and determination that had been developing throughout his multi-state killing career. His ability to lose significant weight, plan complex escape routes, and execute sophisticated getaway plans shows how his criminal sophistication had evolved beyond simple killing to encompass all aspects of criminal operation, including evasion and escape. Bundy's flight to Florida and his final killing spree represent the ultimate expression of his multi-state criminal evolution. Operating in a completely unfamiliar environment under assumed identity required all the skills he had developed during his previous multi-state activities. The psychology of choosing Florida shows his understanding that geographic distance and cultural differences could provide additional camouflage for his activities. The Chi Omega sorority house attacks in Tallahassee reveal how Bundy's psychology had evolved toward increasingly frenzied and disorganized behavior. The multiple victims, extreme violence, and high-risk location show a predator whose psychological controls were deteriorating under the pressure of life as a fugitive. This escalation demonstrates how external stress can exacerbate already pathological psychology and lead to increasingly dangerous behavior. The psychological significance of Bundy's final crime, the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, shows how his victim selection criteria had expanded beyond his original template. This departure from his established patterns suggests either deteriorating psychological controls or escalating needs that could no longer be satisfied by his usual victim type. The age difference represents a significant psychological escalation in his criminal behavior. Bundy's multi-state killing career reveals how geographic mobility can serve multiple psychological functions for serial predators. The constant movement provided new hunting grounds, reduced investigative pressure, and satisfied his need for intellectual stimulation through adaptation to new environments. However, this mobility also created evidence trails across multiple jurisdictions that eventually contributed to his conviction and execution. The psychology of Bundy's interstate crime patterns reveals sophisticated understanding of law enforcement limitations and jurisdictional boundaries. His timing of geographic moves and selection of operational areas shows strategic thinking about investigative challenges and communication difficulties between different law enforcement agencies. This understanding allowed him to exploit systemic weaknesses in multi-jurisdictional investigations. The psychological analysis of how Bundy's crimes evolved across different states shows both consistency in core motivation and adaptation to local circumstances. While his fundamental psychological needs remained constant, his methods and targets showed tactical flexibility that demonstrates sophisticated criminal thinking. This combination of psychological consistency with tactical adaptation made him particularly difficult to track and apprehend. Bundy's multi-state activities reveal how serial predators can use geographic expansion to satisfy escalating psychological needs while managing investigative pressure. Each new location provided opportunities for fresh victims while reducing the likelihood of pattern recognition by local law enforcement. This strategic use of geography shows criminal sophistication that goes far beyond simple mobility. The psychological impact of Bundy's multi-state crimes extended beyond individual victims to affect entire regions and communities. His activities created a climate of fear that influenced behavior patterns across multiple states, demonstrating how individual criminal psychology can have broad social and cultural effects. The geographic scope of his impact shows how sophisticated predators can achieve influence far beyond their immediate criminal activities. Understanding the psychology behind Bundy's geographic expansion helps explain how his criminal career evolved from local predation to national threat. His ability to adapt to new environments while maintaining consistent psychological patterns shows both the flexibility and consistency that characterize sophisticated criminal behavior. This understanding is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in other cases. The multi-state nature of Bundy's crimes reveals how criminal psychology can drive individuals to seek ever larger spheres of influence and control. His geographic expansion represented not just tactical adaptation, but psychological escalation, as his needs for dominance and stimulation required increasingly challenging and extensive criminal activities. This pattern helps explain why some criminals expand their activities rather than remaining in familiar territory. Bundy's cross-country killing spree represents the evolution of his psychology from local predator to what he perceived as a national phenomenon. This expansion satisfied his grandiose self-image while providing the practical benefits of reduced law enforcement coordination. However, it also created the evidence patterns that would eventually lead to his conviction, showing how criminal ambition can ultimately prove self-destructive. The psychology we've examined tonight reveals how geographic expansion can serve multiple functions for sophisticated predators while ultimately contributing to their downfall. Bundy's multi-state crimes show both the advantages and disadvantages of criminal mobility, providing insights into how law enforcement can better coordinate responses to geographically dispersed criminal activities. As we continue our exploration of Bundy's psychology, understanding his multi-state criminal career provides crucial context for examining his capture, legal proceedings, and final confessions. The geographic scope of his crimes created complexities that would influence every aspect of his prosecution and ultimate execution, while the psychological patterns we've identified continued to influence his behavior even in custody. The terror that Bundy spread across multiple states represents one of the most extensive individual criminal campaigns in American history. His ability to maintain criminal activities across such a large geographic area while evading capture for years demonstrates both criminal sophistication and psychological pathology operating at the highest levels. Understanding this combination helps explain both his success as a predator and his ultimate failure as a human being. The multi-state killing spree we've examined reveals Ted Bundy at the height of his criminal powers, operating across multiple jurisdictions with sophisticated planning and execution. This period represents the full flowering of his psychological pathology and criminal capabilities, creating a reign of terror that would ultimately define his legacy and shock the nation with its scope and brutality. As our psychological journey through Ted Bundy's mind continues, we now examine one of the most revealing periods of his criminal career, the events leading to his capture and the psychological deterioration that made his apprehension possible. For years, Bundy had operated with extraordinary psychological control and sophistication, but the mounting pressure of investigation, his escalating criminal needs, and his growing overconfidence eventually created the conditions for his downfall. Understanding the psychology of his capture reveals how even the most calculating predators can be undone by their own psychological patterns. The psychology of criminal overconfidence plays a crucial role in understanding how sophisticated predators like Bundy eventually make the mistakes that lead to their capture. Success breeds confidence, and in Bundy's case, years of successful killings and narrow escapes from detection had created a psychological state where he believed himself to be intellectually superior to law enforcement. This grandiose self-image led to increasingly risky behavior as he sought greater challenges to satisfy his need for intellectual stimulation and dominance. Bundy's decision to approach victims at Lake Sammamish in broad daylight using his real name represents a psychological turning point where overconfidence overcame his normally careful approach to operational security. The fact that multiple witnesses heard him introduce himself as Ted shows either complete contempt for law enforcement capabilities or deteriorating judgment brought on by escalating psychological pressure. This behavior reveals how criminal success can create psychological conditions that ultimately lead to self-destruction. The psychological analysis of Bundy's behavior during this period reveals signs of what experts call criminal burnout, a state where the psychological stress of maintaining a double life begins to overwhelm even sophisticated compartmentalization abilities. The constant vigilance required to maintain his facade while conducting increasingly frequent crimes was taking a psychological toll that manifested in decreased attention to operational security and increased risk-taking behavior. Bundy's first arrest in Utah for possession of burglary tools reveals how routine police work can intersect with sophisticated criminal behavior in unexpected ways. The psychological significance of this arrest lies not in the minor charges, but in how it brought him to law enforcement attention during a period when his behavioral patterns were becoming increasingly erratic. His decision to flee from police during a routine traffic stop shows deteriorating judgment and increasing paranoia. The psychology of Bundy's behavior during police interrogation reveals both his sophisticated understanding of legal processes and his underlying psychological needs for control and recognition. His ability to maintain composure during questioning demonstrates remarkable psychological control, but his subtle attempts to guide the interrogation and demonstrate his legal knowledge show how his narcissistic needs for recognition continued to operate even in custody. This need to appear intelligent and sophisticated would ultimately work against him. Bundy's psychological response to being identified in lineups reveals the intersection between his grandiose self-image and the reality of criminal investigation. His apparent surprise and indignation at being suspected shows how completely he had bought into his own facade of respectability. The psychological shock of being treated as a criminal suspect rather than the sophisticated individual he believed himself to be created cognitive dissonance that affected his judgment during crucial early interactions with law enforcement. The psychology of how Bundy managed his legal representation reveals continued attempts to maintain control even when facing serious criminal charges. His involvement in his own defense, his demands for specific attorneys, and his attempts to manipulate legal proceedings all demonstrate how his control needs persisted even in custody. However, these same control needs also led him to make decisions that ultimately harmed his legal position, showing how psychological patterns can become self-destructive. Bundy's decision to represent himself in court reveals the ultimate expression of his narcissistic belief in his own intellectual superiority. The psychology behind this choice shows someone who genuinely believed he could manipulate legal proceedings through charm and intelligence rather than evidence and legal expertise. This decision demonstrates how grandiose self-image can lead to catastrophically poor judgment in crucial situations requiring objective assessment of capabilities and circumstances. The psychological analysis of Bundy's courtroom behavior reveals a performer who couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate his intelligence and charm to a captive audience. His theatrical presentations, his attempts to charm judges and juries, and his obvious enjoyment of media attention all show how his psychological needs for recognition and admiration continued to operate even when his life was at stake. This need for performance ultimately undermined his legal defense. Bundy's escapes from custody reveal both sophisticated planning abilities and psychological needs that couldn't be satisfied by passive imprisonment. The psychology of his escape planning shows someone who required active control over his circumstances and couldn't psychologically tolerate being completely powerless. His willingness to undertake extraordinary physical and logistical challenges to regain freedom demonstrates how powerful his need for autonomy and control had become. The first escape from Pitkin County Courthouse reveals psychological planning that had been developing for months while maintaining the appearance of cooperation with legal proceedings. His ability to lose significant weight, study building layouts, and plan complex escape routes while appearing to focus on legal defense shows extraordinary psychological compartmentalization and planning abilities. This escape demonstrates how his criminal sophistication extended beyond killing to encompass all aspects of criminal operation. The psychology of Bundy's behavior during his period of freedom between escapes reveals someone whose psychological state was becoming increasingly unstable under pressure. His inability to maintain a low profile, his continued criminal activities, and his eventual second capture show how the stress of life as a fugitive was affecting his normally careful approach to operational security. The psychological pressure of constant vigilance and fear of recapture was taking its toll. Bundy's second escape from Garfield County Jail represents both the culmination of his escape planning abilities and the beginning of his final psychological deterioration. The sophisticated preparation required for this escape, including detailed knowledge of jail construction and guard routines, shows criminal planning at its most advanced level. However, his subsequent behavior in Florida reveals how the psychological stress of constant flight was affecting his judgment and decision-making abilities. The psychology of Bundy's final killing spree in Florida reveals a predator whose psychological controls were rapidly deteriorating under the pressure of life as a fugitive. The frenzied nature of the Chi Omega attacks, the multiple victims, and the high-risk location all represent dramatic departures from his normally calculated approach. This psychological deterioration shows how external stress can exacerbate already pathological psychology and lead to increasingly dangerous and erratic behavior. The Chi Omega attacks themselves reveal psychological disorganization that contrasts sharply with Bundy's earlier sophisticated planning and execution. The extreme violence, the multiple victims in rapid succession, and the physical evidence left at the scene all show someone whose psychological state had deteriorated significantly from his earlier period of careful control. This deterioration made his final capture almost inevitable. Bundy's abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach represents both a departure from his established victim profile and evidence of further psychological deterioration. The choice of a much younger victim, the daylight abduction from a public location, and the relative lack of sophisticated planning all show someone whose psychological patterns were breaking down under stress. This crime demonstrates how psychological deterioration can lead to increasingly impulsive and poorly planned criminal behavior. The psychology of Bundy's final capture reveals a predator whose sophisticated operational security had completely collapsed. His driving of a stolen vehicle with burned-out headlights in an area where he was actively being sought shows judgment so poor that it suggests significant psychological impairment. The contrast between this careless behavior and his earlier careful planning demonstrates how psychological stress and deterioration can overwhelm even sophisticated criminal thinking. Bundy's behavior during his final arrest reveals both psychological exhaustion and continued attempts to maintain control through manipulation. His initial attempts to charm the arresting officers, his efforts to create confusion about his identity, and his eventual resignation to capture all show different aspects of his psychological state during this crucial period. The psychology of these interactions reveals someone whose usual manipulation techniques were failing due to deteriorated psychological condition. The psychological analysis of how law enforcement finally assembled the evidence to convict Bundy reveals the intersection between his deteriorating psychological state and improved investigative techniques. His earlier careful attention to evidence destruction had given way to careless behavior that left physical traces at crime scenes. This deterioration in criminal tradecraft directly contributed to the evidence that would ultimately convict him. Understanding the psychology of Bundy's capture helps explain how even the most sophisticated predators can eventually be undone by their own psychological patterns. His need for recognition, his grandiose self-image, and his escalating risk-taking behavior all contributed to creating the conditions that made his apprehension possible. This pattern shows how psychological drives that initially enable criminal success can ultimately lead to criminal downfall. The psychology of criminal deterioration under pressure reveals patterns that are common among sophisticated predators who operate for extended periods. The constant psychological stress of maintaining false identities, evading detection, and satisfying escalating criminal needs eventually overwhelms even the most sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms. Understanding these patterns helps law enforcement recognize when predators may be becoming more vulnerable to capture. Bundy's capture represents the culmination of a psychological process that had been building throughout his criminal career. His increasing boldness, his need for greater challenges, and his growing belief in his own invincibility all contributed to the behavioral changes that made his apprehension possible. This process shows how criminal psychology can contain the seeds of its own destruction. The psychological lessons from Bundy's capture reveal important insights about how sophisticated criminals can be defeated through understanding their psychological patterns rather than simply their criminal methods. His psychological needs for recognition, control, and intellectual stimulation all became vulnerabilities that could be exploited by patient and sophisticated investigation techniques. The deterioration we've examined tonight shows how even the most calculating and sophisticated predators are ultimately limited by their own psychological patterns. Bundy's capture wasn't just the result of good police work, but the inevitable consequence of psychological pressures and patterns that made his continued freedom unsustainable. Understanding these psychological dynamics helps explain both how such predators operate and how they can ultimately be stopped. As we continue our exploration of Bundy's psychology, understanding the circumstances of his capture provides crucial context for examining his behavior in custody, his legal strategies, and his eventual confessions. The psychological patterns that led to his downfall continued to influence his behavior throughout his incarceration and ultimately shaped how his story would end. The psychology of Bundy's capture reveals the fundamental truth that even the most sophisticated criminals are ultimately prisoners of their own psychological patterns. The same drives that enabled his criminal success, the need for control, the grandiose self-image, the intellectual arrogance ultimately created the conditions for his downfall. This psychological irony represents one of the most important lessons from studying criminal behavior at this level of sophistication. The mask that Bundy had worn so successfully for years finally slipped, not because of external pressure alone, but because the psychological effort required to maintain it had become unsustainable. Understanding this process helps us recognize how criminal facades eventually collapse under their own psychological weight, providing hope that even the most sophisticated predators will eventually reveal themselves through their own psychological limitations. As our psychological exploration of Ted Bundy continues, we now examine one of the most revealing periods of his life, his behavior while in custody awaiting trial and execution. The controlled environment of incarceration stripped away many of the external props that had supported his carefully constructed public persona, revealing deeper aspects of his psychology that had been hidden behind his mask of sanity. Understanding Bundy's behavior in custody provides crucial insights into how his mind operated when deprived of the power and control that had driven his criminal career. The psychology of how sophisticated criminals adapt to incarceration reveals patterns that distinguish different types of offenders. For someone like Bundy, whose entire psychological system was built around control and manipulation, the restrictions of custody created unique challenges that required significant psychological adaptation. His response to these challenges provides insights into the core elements of his personality and the defense mechanisms he employed when his usual sources of psychological satisfaction were removed. Bundy's initial response to incarceration reveals someone who was psychologically unprepared for the reality of being completely powerless. His early attempts to maintain his public image, his demands for special treatment, and his efforts to manipulate prison staff all show how difficult it was for him to accept his changed circumstances. The psychology of this adjustment period reveals the depth of his need for control and the extent to which his self-image depended on his ability to manipulate his environment. The psychological significance of Bundy's decision to represent himself in court becomes clearer when viewed through the lens of his custodial experience. Faced with the complete loss of control in his daily life, the courtroom became the only arena where he could still exercise his manipulation skills and demonstrate his intellectual abilities. This legal self-representation served crucial psychological functions beyond mere legal strategy, providing necessary outlets for his narcissistic needs and control requirements. Bundy's behavior during his trials reveals how his psychological patterns adapted to the constraints of custody while maintaining their essential characteristics. His theatrical courtroom presentations, his attempts to charm judges and juries, and his obvious enjoyment of media attention all demonstrate how he transformed legal proceedings into performances designed to satisfy his psychological needs for recognition and admiration. The courtroom became his stage for demonstrating the intellectual superiority he could no longer express through criminal activities. The psychology of Bundy's interactions with other inmates reveals important aspects of his character that were less visible during his free criminal career. His ability to maintain distance from typical prison violence while establishing himself as an intellectual authority shows how his manipulation skills translated to the prison environment. His role as a legal advisor to other inmates provided him with a form of power and control that partially satisfied his psychological needs while maintaining his self-image as superior to his surroundings. Bundy's relationship with his legal team reveals ongoing attempts to maintain control even when supposedly cooperating with his defense. His insistence on directing legal strategy, his demands for specific approaches, and his tendency to override attorney recommendations all show how his control needs persisted even when his life was at stake. This pattern demonstrates how deeply ingrained his psychological patterns had become and how they continued to operate even in circumstances where they were clearly counterproductive. The psychological analysis of Bundy's media interactions while in custody reveals someone who understood that public attention was one of the few remaining sources of psychological satisfaction available to him. His carefully orchestrated interviews, his strategic revelations of information, and his obvious pleasure in discussing his crimes all show how he transformed media attention into a substitute for the power and control he had previously exercised over victims. The media became unwilling participants in feeding his narcissistic needs. Bundy's romantic relationships while in custody provide fascinating insights into his psychological patterns and manipulation abilities. His marriage to Carolyn Boone while on trial demonstrates his continued ability to inspire devotion and loyalty despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The psychology of these relationships reveals how his charm and manipulation skills remained effective even in the most compromising circumstances, suggesting that these abilities were more fundamental to his personality than his criminal activities. The birth of Bundy's daughter while he was on death row creates one of the most psychologically complex aspects of his custodial period. His apparent ability to compartmentalize his roles as father and convicted killer reveals extraordinary psychological splitting that allowed him to maintain different identities simultaneously. This compartmentalization shows how his psychological defense mechanisms continued to operate even in circumstances that would overwhelm most people's ability to maintain coherent self-image. Bundy's psychological state during the appeals process reveals someone who oscillated between grandiose confidence in his ability to manipulate the legal system and growing awareness of his ultimate powerlessness. His continued belief that his intelligence and charm could overcome overwhelming evidence shows the persistence of his narcissistic delusions, while his increasing desperation as appeals were exhausted reveals moments of psychological reality breaking through his defensive structures. The psychology of how Bundy managed the stress of death row reveals both remarkable psychological resilience and gradual deterioration under extreme pressure. His ability to maintain intellectual activities, continue legal work, and sustain relationships shows extraordinary psychological strength. while his increasing preoccupation with his legacy and growing willingness to discuss his crimes suggests underlying psychological changes brought on by the reality of his circumstances. Bundy's interactions with law enforcement during his custodial period reveal ongoing attempts to maintain psychological advantage even when completely powerless. His strategic release of information, his demands for specific investigators, and his attempts to control the pace and content of confessions all show how he tried to transform even his cooperation into demonstrations of power and control. These interactions reveal how his psychological patterns persisted even when serving no practical purpose. The psychological significance of Bundy's eventual confessions reveals complex motivations that went beyond simple cooperation with authorities. His decision to reveal details of previously unknown crimes appears to have served multiple psychological functions, maintaining his image as someone with important information, exercising control over the investigative process, and satisfying his need for recognition as an authority on his own criminal behavior. The confessions became final expressions of his narcissistic psychology. Bundy's behavior as his execution approached reveals psychological patterns that illuminate his core personality structure. His alternating attempts to delay execution through appeals and his apparent acceptance of his fate show internal conflicts between his survival instincts and his psychological need to maintain dignity and control. His final interviews and statements reveal someone still trying to manage his public image even in the face of death. The psychology of Bundy's religious interests during his final period reveals either genuine spiritual searching or sophisticated manipulation of religious authorities and public opinion. His interactions with religious advisors, his expressions of remorse, and his discussions of spiritual matters all show psychological complexity that makes it difficult to determine whether his religious engagement was authentic or performative. This ambiguity reflects the fundamental duplicity that characterized his entire psychology. Bundy's final confessions to investigators reveal psychological motivations that appear to combine genuine cooperation with continued manipulation and control. His detailed descriptions of crimes, his insights into his own psychology, and his analysis of investigative techniques all show someone who maintained intellectual engagement with his criminal career even while facing execution. These confessions provided final outlets for his need to be recognized as an authority and expert. The psychological analysis of Bundy's death row interviews reveals someone who had developed considerable insight into his own psychological patterns while maintaining fundamental denial about the full extent of his responsibility. His ability to discuss his crimes in clinical terms while avoiding genuine emotional engagement shows psychological detachment that persisted even in his final period. This pattern suggests that his core psychological structure remained largely unchanged despite years of incarceration and therapy. Bundy's legacy management activities during his final years reveal psychological patterns that extended his manipulation and control needs beyond his own death. His strategic revelations of information, his cooperation with specific authors and investigators, and his attempts to shape how his story would be told all show someone who was trying to exercise posthumous control over his reputation and impact. This forward-looking manipulation demonstrates the persistence of his psychological patterns even when facing execution. The psychology of how Bundy's behavior in custody affected those around him reveals the continuing power of his manipulation abilities even in severely constrained circumstances. His impact on fellow inmates, prison staff, attorneys, and journalists shows how his psychological influence extended far beyond his immediate circumstances. Understanding these patterns helps explain how sophisticated manipulators can maintain influence even when apparently powerless. Bundy's custodial period reveals how incarceration affected someone whose entire psychological system was built around power and control. The forced powerlessness of prison life created psychological pressures that revealed both his remarkable adaptability and his fundamental psychological limitations. His responses to these pressures illuminate core aspects of his personality that had been masked by his criminal activities and public persona. The psychological insights gained from studying Bundy's custodial behavior have influenced modern approaches to managing sophisticated criminals in institutional settings. His case revealed how traditional prison management techniques might be inadequate for dealing with highly intelligent and manipulative individuals who can continue to exercise psychological influence even when physically constrained. These insights have informed policies for managing similar high-profile criminals. Understanding Bundy's psychology during custody helps explain how his criminal patterns persisted even when criminal behavior was impossible. His continued manipulation, his need for control, and his narcissistic requirements all found new outlets within the prison environment, showing how fundamental personality patterns can adapt to drastically changed circumstances while maintaining their essential characteristics. The custodial period we've examined tonight reveals Ted Bundy's psychology stripped of many of its external supports and adaptations. In this constrained environment, we see more clearly the core patterns that drove his behavior throughout his life. His continued manipulation, his persistent need for control, and his undiminished narcissism all operated within the prison environment, providing insights into the fundamental structure of his personality. The psychology of Bundy in custody reveals both the persistence and the limitations of even the most sophisticated criminal psychology. While his manipulation abilities remain formidable, the constraints of imprisonment gradually revealed the underlying fragility of his psychological structure. This period shows how even the most calculating criminals are ultimately vulnerable to the psychological pressures of their circumstances. As we continue our exploration of Bundy's psychology, understanding his custodial behavior provides crucial context for examining his final confessions and the ultimate resolution of his case. The psychological patterns we've observed tonight continued to influence his behavior until his execution, shaping how his story would end and how his legacy would be remembered by future generations. The period behind bars revealed Ted Bundy as a man whose sophisticated criminal psychology continued to operate even when criminal behavior was impossible. His adaptation to custody shows both the remarkable flexibility of his psychological patterns and their ultimate inability to provide genuine satisfaction when deprived of their original outlets. This period represents the final chapter in understanding how one of history's most sophisticated criminals maintained his psychological structure even in the face of ultimate defeat. As our psychological journey through Ted Bundy's mind approaches its most revealing phase, we now examine his final confessions and the complex psychology behind his decision to reveal the truth about his crimes. In the shadow of execution, Bundy began providing detailed accounts of murders that had remained unsolved for years, creating one of the most psychologically significant confession periods in criminal history. Understanding the motivations and psychological processes behind these confessions reveals the final evolution of his manipulative psychology and provides crucial insights into how his mind operated even when facing death. The psychology of deathbed confessions in criminal cases reveals complex motivations that often combine genuine remorse with continued manipulation and control. For someone like Bundy, whose entire psychological system was built around power and influence, the confession process provided a final opportunity to exercise control over investigators, victims' families, and public perception. His confessions weren't simply admissions of guilt but carefully orchestrated performances designed to serve multiple psychological and practical purposes. Bundy's decision to begin confessing in earnest during his final years on death row reflects a psychological calculation about the value of information versus the inevitability of execution. As his appeals were exhausted and execution became imminent, his previously worthless admissions suddenly became valuable commodities that could potentially buy time, attention, and a form of immortality through continued relevance to investigators and the media. This transformation of confession from liability to asset reveals the calculating nature of his psychology even in extremis. The psychological timing of Bundy's confessions reveals strategic thinking about maximum impact and control. Rather than providing all information at once, he parceled out details over months and years, maintaining ongoing relevance and continuing to exercise power over the investigative process. This piecemeal approach allowed him to remain the center of attention while controlling the pace and focus of revelations, satisfying his narcissistic needs while serving practical purposes related to his legal situation. The psychology behind Bundy's selection of which crimes to confess reveals continued manipulation even in his supposedly truthful admissions. He chose to reveal details about cases where conviction was unlikely while maintaining denials about crimes where additional prosecution might be possible. This selective honesty demonstrates how his confessions served strategic purposes beyond simple truth-telling, showing that even his final admissions were calculated to serve his interests. Bundy's detailed descriptions of his crimes during confession sessions reveal psychological patterns that illuminate his mental state during the murders themselves. His clinical, detached recounting of extreme violence shows the emotional disconnection that enabled his criminal behavior while also serving defensive functions that protected his self-image during the confession process. This psychological distancing allowed him to discuss horrific acts without experiencing the emotional impact that would normally accompany such admissions. The psychology of how Bundy described his victims during confessions reveals ongoing dehumanization that persisted even years after their deaths. His references to victims by physical characteristics rather than names, his focus on their utility for his purposes rather than their humanity, and his apparent inability to express genuine empathy all show how his fundamental psychological patterns remained unchanged despite years of incarceration and supposed reflection. Bundy's confessions about his psychological state during crimes reveal insights into the mental processes of a serial killer that are rarely available from other sources. His descriptions of the fantasy development, the planning phases, and the psychological satisfaction derived from control and violence provide unprecedented glimpses into the mind of a predator. However, the reliability of these self-reports must be evaluated carefully given his history of manipulation and his ongoing psychological needs. The psychological analysis of Bundy's confession style reveals someone who maintained his need to be perceived as intelligent and sophisticated even when admitting to brutal crimes. His use of psychological terminology, his analytical approach to discussing his own behavior, and his apparent enjoyment of the intellectual exercise all show how he transformed confession into another arena for demonstrating his perceived superiority and expertise. Bundy's interactions with investigators during confession sessions reveal ongoing attempts to maintain psychological control even when providing cooperation. His demands for specific investigators, his insistence on controlling interview conditions, and his strategic use of information as leverage all demonstrate how he continued to exercise power within the confession process. These patterns show how his core psychological needs persisted even when serving seemingly altruistic purposes. The psychology of how Bundy's confessions affected investigators reveals the continuing power of his manipulation abilities even in custody. Many investigators found themselves developing complex relationships with him that combined professional necessity with personal engagement, showing how his charm and apparent cooperation could influence even experienced law enforcement professionals. Understanding these dynamics helps explain how sophisticated manipulators can maintain influence even when apparently powerless. Bundy's revelations about previously unknown crimes reveal psychological motivations that combine genuine cooperation with continued attention-seeking behavior. Each new confession brought renewed media coverage and investigative attention, satisfying his narcissistic needs while serving the practical purpose of demonstrating ongoing value to authorities. This combination of genuine information with self-serving motivation characterizes much of his confession period. The psychological significance of Bundy's admissions about the extent of his crimes reveals someone whose need for recognition outweighed his desire for privacy or dignity. His revelations about crimes spanning multiple decades and numerous states served to establish him as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, satisfying his grandiose self-image while ensuring his place in criminal history. These admissions were as much about establishing his criminal legacy as providing closure for families. Bundy's discussions of his psychological development during confessions reveal complex self-awareness combined with fundamental denial about personal responsibility. His ability to analyze his own behavior in clinical terms while maintaining that he was somehow different from his actions shows psychological splitting that allowed him to acknowledge his crimes without accepting full emotional responsibility for them. This pattern reveals how sophisticated criminals can maintain self-image even when admitting horrific behavior. The psychology of how Bundy's confessions evolved over time reveals growing desperation as execution approached, combined with continued attempts to maintain control and relevance. Early confessions were strategic and limited, while later admissions became more detailed and extensive as his legal options diminished. This evolution shows how external pressures gradually overcame his usual careful approach to information management. Bundy's final interviews with investigators reveal psychological patterns that had remained consistent throughout his criminal career and incarceration. His continued manipulation, his need for intellectual recognition, and his fundamental inability to experience genuine empathy all persisted even in his final period. These patterns show how core personality structures can remain remarkably stable even under extreme circumstances. The psychological impact of Bundy's confessions on victims' families reveals both the potential benefits and psychological costs of detailed admissions. While many families gain closure from learning the fate of their loved ones, others experience renewed trauma from graphic descriptions of violence. Understanding these impacts helps inform decisions about how confession information should be handled and shared in similar cases. Bundy's attempts to provide psychological insights into his own behavior during confessions reveal both genuine self-awareness and continued manipulation of professional relationships. His discussions with psychologists and psychiatrists served multiple purposes. They provided additional attention and intellectual stimulation while potentially supporting future appeal efforts based on mental health issues. This dual purpose shows how even apparently cooperative behavior served his strategic interests. The psychology of how Bundy managed his public image during the confession period reveals ongoing concern with how he would be remembered after execution. His strategic media interactions, his cooperation with specific authors and journalists, and his attempts to shape public understanding of his crimes all show someone who was actively managing his posthumous reputation. This forward-looking manipulation demonstrates the persistence of his narcissistic needs even when facing death. Bundy's final confessions about his earliest crimes reveal psychological patterns that had been developing since childhood but had remained hidden throughout his criminal career. His admissions about early violent fantasies, animal cruelty, and juvenile antisocial behavior provide insights into the developmental trajectory of his pathology. These revelations help complete the psychological picture of how his criminal behavior evolved over decades. The psychological analysis of inconsistencies in Bundy's confessions reveals ongoing deception and manipulation even during supposedly truthful admissions. His tendency to minimize his role in certain crimes while exaggerating others, his strategic omissions of details that might harm his image, and his apparent fabrication of some elements all show how his manipulative psychology operated even within the confession process. Understanding the psychology of Bundy's final confessions helps distinguish between genuine cooperation and continued manipulation in similar cases. His pattern of strategic admissions, selective honesty, and ongoing attempts to control narrative provides a template for recognizing when confession processes may be serving the confessor's psychological needs as much as investigative purposes. The confession period we've examined tonight reveals Ted Bundy's psychology in its final form, still manipulative, still seeking control and recognition, but now constrained by the reality of approaching execution. His confessions represent both genuine attempts to provide closure and continued expressions of his narcissistic psychology, showing how even in extremis, he remained fundamentally unchanged in his core psychological patterns. The psychological legacy of Bundy's confessions extends beyond their immediate investigative value to influence how law enforcement approaches similar cases. His demonstration of how sophisticated criminals can maintain manipulation even while confessing has informed training and protocols for managing high-profile confession processes and evaluating the reliability of admissions from manipulative offenders. As we continue our exploration of Bundy's psychology, understanding his confession period provides crucial context for examining his final psychological state and the ultimate resolution of his case. The patterns we've observed tonight would continue to influence his behavior until his execution, shaping the final chapter of one of criminal history's most psychologically complex cases. The confessions we've analyzed reveal the final evolution of Ted Bundy's psychology, a mind that remained calculating and manipulative even when facing death, using even truthful admissions as tools for continued control and recognition. This period shows how the most fundamental aspects of criminal psychology can persist even when all external motivations have been removed, revealing the true depth and intractability of severe personality disorders. The truth that emerged during Bundy's final confessions was filtered through psychological patterns that had remained consistent throughout his life. Even in death's shadow, he remained a manipulator, a performer, and a predator, seeking to exercise whatever control remained available to him. Understanding this psychology helps us recognize how even seemingly cooperative criminals may continue to serve their own interests through the very process of confession. As our comprehensive psychological journey through Ted Bundy's mind approaches its climax, we now examine the fundamental question that has driven our entire exploration: what psychological framework could produce such calculated evil? Understanding Bundy's mental architecture requires us to synthesize everything we've learned about his development, motivations, and behavior patterns into a coherent picture of how evil can manifest in human psychology. This segment explores the deepest levels of his pathology and helps us understand not just what he did, but how his mind could conceive and execute such horrific acts. The psychology of evil has been debated by philosophers, theologians, and scientists for centuries, but Bundy's case provides one of the clearest examples of how evil can emerge from identifiable psychological patterns rather than mysterious supernatural forces. His evil wasn't the product of sudden madness or uncontrollable impulses, but the systematic result of psychological development that perverted normal human capacities for empathy, connection, and moral reasoning into tools for predation and destruction. Bundy's psychological framework reveals what experts call primary psychopathy, a condition where the individual lacks fundamental emotional connections to other human beings while maintaining sophisticated intellectual and social abilities. This combination created someone who could understand human psychology intellectually while being completely unable to experience genuine emotional connection or empathy. He could study human emotions like a scientist, studying specimens, learning to mimic and manipulate feelings he could never actually experience. The development of Bundy's evil psychology appears to have begun with early attachment disruptions that prevented him from forming the emotional bonds that normally constrain violent behavior toward others. Without these fundamental connections, other human beings remained objects to be manipulated rather than people deserving of moral consideration. This emotional blindness allowed him to treat his victims with the same casual indifference most people reserve for inanimate objects. The psychological architecture of Bundy's evil reveals sophisticated cognitive abilities working in service of fundamentally amoral goals. His intelligence, charm, and social skills, qualities that in normal individuals serve prosocial purposes, became weapons for identifying, manipulating, and destroying victims. This perversion of positive human qualities into tools of evil represents one of the most disturbing aspects of his psychology and challenges comfortable assumptions about the relationship between intelligence and morality. Bundy's mental framework operated on what psychologists call instrumental reasoning, the ability to plan and execute complex strategies to achieve desired goals while lacking moral reasoning, the capacity to consider whether those goals are ethically acceptable. This combination allowed him to approach murder with the same methodical planning that others might apply to legitimate endeavors, treating killing as simply another problem to be solved rather than a moral transgression to be avoided. The psychology of how Bundy maintained his evil behavior over years reveals sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms that protected him from experiencing guilt, remorse, or empathy that might interfere with his criminal activities. His ability to compartmentalize different aspects of his life, his rationalization of his actions as somehow justified or inevitable, and his fundamental inability to view his victims as fully human all served to maintain his psychological equilibrium while committing horrific acts. Bundy's evil psychology reveals the dangerous potential of narcissistic personality disorder when combined with antisocial traits and high intelligence. His grandiose self-image, his belief in his own superiority, and his complete lack of empathy for others created a psychological framework where other people existed solely to serve his needs and desires. This combination made him capable of treating human beings as disposable objects while maintaining his self-image as someone special and superior. The psychological analysis of Bundy's evil reveals how cognitive distortions can support and maintain immoral behavior over extended periods. His ability to rationalize his actions, minimize the suffering of his victims, and maintain beliefs about his own specialness all show how the human mind can construct elaborate justifications for even the most heinous behavior. These distortions allowed him to continue his crimes while avoiding the psychological consequences that would normally result from such actions. Bundy's mental framework reveals what psychologists call moral disengagement, the ability to deactivate normal moral constraints through various psychological mechanisms. He could redefine his actions as somehow acceptable, blame his victims for their fate, minimize the harm he caused, and view himself as above normal moral considerations. This psychological flexibility allowed him to maintain his criminal behavior while avoiding the mental distress that would normally result from violating fundamental moral principles. The psychology of Bundy's evil shows how fantasy and reality can become dangerously intertwined in severely disturbed minds. His violent sexual fantasies provided a psychological rehearsal space where he could perfect his crimes and experience control and dominance without immediate consequences. The gradual progression from fantasy to reality shows how psychological evil can develop through mental practice before manifesting in actual behavior. Bundy's psychological framework reveals the terrifying potential of human intelligence when completely divorced from empathy and moral constraint. His case demonstrates that intellectual sophistication alone is insufficient to prevent evil behavior and may actually enable more sophisticated and effective forms of evil. This understanding challenges cultural assumptions that education and intelligence naturally lead to moral behavior. The development of Bundy's evil psychology appears to have been influenced by a combination of genetic predisposition, early trauma, and environmental factors that created optimal conditions for the emergence of psychopathic traits, while many people experience similar risk factors without becoming killers. The particular combination of elements in Bundy's case created a psychological perfect storm that produced one of history's most notorious predators. Bundy's mental architecture reveals how evil can hide behind a facade of normalcy and even admirable qualities. His case shows that evil doesn't always announce itself through obvious signs of disturbance, but can operate through charm, intelligence, and apparent social success. This camouflaged evil is particularly dangerous because it exploits our assumptions about what dangerous people look like and how they behave. The psychology of Bundy's evil reveals the importance of early intervention when warning signs of severe personality disorders appear in childhood and adolescence. His case shows how untreated psychological problems can escalate over time, developing into patterns that become increasingly resistant to change or treatment. Understanding these developmental patterns provides hope for preventing similar tragedies through early identification and intervention. Bundy's psychological framework demonstrates how evil can become self-reinforcing through psychological mechanisms that reward and maintain antisocial behavior. Each successful crime provided psychological satisfaction that reinforced his behavior patterns while building confidence in his abilities. This positive feedback loop created addiction-like patterns that made stopping increasingly difficult as his criminal career progressed. The analysis of Bundy's evil psychology reveals how moral development can be severely impaired by psychological disorders that affect empathy, emotional connection, and the ability to consider others' welfare. His case provides insights into how moral reasoning develops in normal individuals and what happens when this development is disrupted by severe personality pathology. Bundy's mental framework reveals the terrifying efficiency that can result when evil psychology is combined with high intelligence and sophisticated planning abilities. His case shows how psychological evil can operate with scientific precision, treating human destruction as an engineering problem to be solved rather than a moral issue to be considered. This calculated approach to evil represents one of the most chilling aspects of his psychology. The psychology of Bundy's evil challenges comfortable assumptions about human nature and the relationship between appearance and reality. His case forces us to confront the possibility that evil can exist behind the most pleasant and trustworthy facades, operating through the very qualities we've been taught to admire and trust. This recognition is crucial for developing better protection against similar predators. Understanding Bundy's psychological framework helps explain why traditional rehabilitation approaches are often ineffective with severe psychopaths. His case demonstrates how fundamental personality structures can be so severely disturbed that change may be impossible even with intensive treatment. This understanding has important implications for criminal justice policy and public safety considerations. Bundy's evil psychology reveals how cultural and social factors can enable predatory behavior by providing camouflage and opportunity for those who understand how to exploit social expectations and assumptions. His case shows how predators can weaponize social norms and expectations, using society's own values as tools for identifying and accessing victims. The psychological analysis of Bundy's evil provides insights into recognition and prevention that extend beyond individual cases to inform broader understanding of how such psychology develops and operates. His case has influenced training for law enforcement, mental health professionals, and educators who work with at-risk populations, helping develop better tools for early identification and intervention. Bundy's mental framework represents a case study in how human psychology can develop along fundamentally different lines from normal emotional and moral development. His case provides evidence that some individuals may be born with or develop psychological structures that make them fundamentally incompatible with social cooperation and moral behavior, challenging assumptions about universal human nature. The psychology of evil we've examined tonight reveals Ted Bundy as someone whose mental architecture was fundamentally different from normal human psychology. His combination of high intelligence, complete emotional detachment, and sophisticated manipulation abilities created a predator capable of operating undetected while committing horrific crimes. Understanding this psychology is crucial for recognizing and preventing similar cases. The evil that Bundy embodied wasn't supernatural or mysterious, but the result of identifiable psychological patterns that can be studied, understood, and potentially recognized in others. His case provides a roadmap for understanding how evil develops and operates, offering hope that through knowledge and vigilance, similar tragedies can be prevented. The psychological framework we've analyzed represents the complete corruption of human potential intelligence used for manipulation, charm deployed for predation, and social skills perverted into tools for evil. Understanding how these positive qualities can be corrupted provides insights into both the development of evil and the protection of society against those who would exploit human virtues for destructive purposes. As we prepare for our final segment exploring Bundy's execution and legacy, understanding his psychological framework provides the foundation for comprehending how his case has influenced modern understanding of criminal psychology and public safety. The evil we've examined tonight didn't end with his death, but continues to influence how we understand and protect against similar threats. The mind we've explored represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of psychological evil in criminal history. Through understanding how Bundy's psychology operated, we gain insights not just into his individual case, but into the broader patterns that characterize the most dangerous forms of human predation. This knowledge serves as our best defense against recognizing and stopping similar monsters before they can perfect their deadly craft. As our psychological exploration reaches its darkest conclusion, we examine the final chapter of Ted Bundy's life, his execution by electric chair on January 24, 1989. The psychology of how he faced death reveals the ultimate test of his carefully constructed persona and provides final insights into the mind that had terrorized the nation for over a decade. Understanding Bundy's psychological state during his final hours illuminates how even the most calculating criminals confront their mortality and whether genuine human emotion can emerge when all pretense is stripped away. The psychology of death row inmates facing execution reveals patterns that vary dramatically based on personality type, criminal history, and psychological makeup. For someone like Bundy, whose entire identity was built around control and manipulation, the approach of execution represented the ultimate challenge to his psychological defense systems. His behavior during this final period would reveal whether his sophisticated persona could withstand the ultimate test of powerlessness. Bundy's psychological response to his final appeals being denied reveals someone who had maintained hope in his intellectual superiority until the very end. His shock and apparent disbelief when legal options were exhausted shows how completely he had believed in his ability to manipulate the system indefinitely. This reaction demonstrates the depth of his narcissistic delusions and his fundamental inability to accept that his intelligence couldn't overcome every obstacle. The psychology of Bundy's final confession marathon in his last days reveals desperate attempts to maintain relevance and control even as execution approached. His sudden willingness to provide detailed information about previously undisclosed crimes served multiple psychological functions. It gave him continued attention and importance while providing a final opportunity to exercise power over investigators and victims' families. These confessions represented last-ditch efforts to maintain psychological significance. Bundy's interactions with spiritual advisors during his final period reveal complex psychological patterns that may represent either genuine spiritual searching or sophisticated manipulation of religious authorities. His discussions of faith, expressions of remorse, and apparent religious conversion could represent authentic spiritual awakening or calculated attempts to generate sympathy and potential intervention. The ambiguity of his religious engagement reflects the fundamental duplicity that characterized his entire psychology. The psychological analysis of Bundy's final interviews reveals someone struggling to maintain his carefully constructed image while facing the breakdown of all psychological defenses. His alternating attempts to appear scholarly and analytical about his crimes, combined with moments of apparent genuine emotion, show the internal conflict between his public persona and his underlying psychological reality. These interviews provide rare glimpses of vulnerability beneath his manipulative facade. Bundy's final visits with family members reveal psychological patterns that had characterized his relationships throughout his life. His ability to maintain emotional connections with people who cared about him while facing execution for horrific crimes demonstrates the compartmentalization that had enabled his criminal career. These final interactions show how he continued to manage multiple identities even in his last hours. The psychology of how Bundy prepared for execution reveals someone whose need for control persisted even when facing the ultimate powerlessness. His insistence on specific procedures, his demands for particular witnesses, and his attempts to orchestrate the timing and circumstances of his death all show how he tried to maintain psychological agency even when physical agency was completely removed. Control remained his primary psychological need until the end. Bundy's behavior on his final day reveals psychological patterns that illuminate his core personality structure under ultimate stress. His apparent calm demeanor, his continued attempts at intellectual conversation, and his efforts to maintain dignity all show someone whose psychological defenses remained largely intact even when facing imminent death. This consistency suggests how deeply ingrained his personality patterns had become. The psychology of Bundy's final meal and last requests reveals someone who maintained attention to detail and personal preferences even in extremis. His specific food choices and final arrangements show how he continued to exercise whatever control remained available while demonstrating that his capacity for planning and decision-making remained intact until his final hours. Bundy's final walk to the electric chair reveals the ultimate test of his psychological composure and control. Witness accounts describe someone who maintained outward calm while showing subtle signs of internal stress, a final demonstration of the sophisticated emotional regulation that had characterized his entire criminal career. His ability to maintain composure even in these circumstances shows the remarkable strength of his psychological defense systems. The psychology of Bundy's final words reveals someone who maintained his characteristic patterns of self-presentation even when facing death. His expressions of love for family members, his apparent spiritual references, and his attempts to maintain dignity all show how he tried to control his final public image. These last statements represent final attempts to shape how he would be remembered. The psychological significance of the crowd that gathered outside the prison to celebrate Bundy's execution reveals the profound impact his crimes had on public consciousness. The party-like atmosphere and expressions of satisfaction show how his case had created unprecedented public investment in seeing justice carried out. This public reaction demonstrates the psychological wound his crimes had inflicted on society's sense of safety and order. Bundy's execution represents the final resolution of a psychological case that had challenged traditional understanding of criminal behavior and human evil. His death brought closure to families of victims while ending the career of someone who had redefined public understanding of serial killing and criminal manipulation. The psychological impact of his execution extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect broader cultural understanding of justice and retribution. The psychology of how Bundy's execution was reported and received reveals cultural patterns in how society processes the death of notorious criminals. The extensive media coverage, public celebration, and ongoing analysis all show how his case had become embedded in national consciousness. His execution became a cultural event that transcended simple criminal justice to touch deeper questions about evil and punishment. The immediate aftermath of Bundy's execution reveals how his death affected different constituencies in various ways. Victims' families experienced relief and closure. Law enforcement felt satisfaction at the conclusion of a long investigation, and the public celebrated the end of a threat that had haunted them for years. However, the execution also marked the end of ongoing confessions that might have provided closure in additional cases. The psychological legacy of Bundy's execution extends beyond the immediate resolution of his case to influence broader criminal justice policies and public attitudes toward capital punishment. His case became a defining example in debates about the death penalty, demonstrating how notorious criminals can shape public policy discussions through the sheer magnitude of their crimes and public impact. Understanding the psychology of Bundy's final hours provides insights into how the most sophisticated criminals face their ultimate defeat. His case shows how psychological defense mechanisms and personality patterns can persist even under the most extreme circumstances, while also revealing the ultimate limitations of manipulation and control when confronted with absolute powerlessness. The execution we've examined tonight represents the final chapter in one of criminal psychology's most significant cases. Bundy's death ended a career that had redefined understanding of serial killing while providing closure to a case that had captivated and terrified the nation. The psychology we've observed during his final hours reflects patterns that had characterized his entire life. Bundy's execution marked the end of a psychological journey that had begun with childhood trauma and evolved through sophisticated criminal behavior to ultimate accountability. His death represents both justice for his victims and the final resolution of a case that had challenged every assumption about criminal behavior and human evil. The psychology of his final hours provides fitting closure to our exploration of his mind. The electric chair that ended Ted Bundy's life also ended one of the most psychologically complex criminal careers in American history. His execution represents the ultimate failure of intelligence and manipulation when confronted with justice and accountability. The psychology we've examined throughout this journey culminated in those final moments when all pretense was stripped away and the man behind the mask faced his final judgment. The death that occurred in Florida's electric chair on that January morning ended more than just Ted Bundy's life. It ended a chapter in American criminal history and provided closure to one of the most psychologically fascinating and disturbing cases ever documented. Understanding how his psychology operated until the very end provides crucial insights into the nature of human evil and the ultimate triumph of justice over even the most sophisticated criminal minds. As we prepare to examine Bundy's lasting legacy and impact on modern criminal psychology, his execution serves as the final punctuation mark on a case that changed how we understand serial killing, criminal manipulation, and human evil. The psychology that died with him continues to influence our understanding of criminal behavior and our efforts to protect society from similar predators. The final hours we've examined reveal Ted Bundy's psychology in its ultimate form, still calculating, still manipulative, but finally powerless to escape the consequences of his actions. His execution represents the triumph of justice over evil and provides reassurance that even the most sophisticated predators can ultimately be held accountable for their crimes. The psychology of evil that we've studied throughout this journey ended definitively in the electric chair, but its impact on our understanding of criminal behavior continues to influence law enforcement, mental health professionals, and society's approach to protecting against similar threats. Bundy's death marked an ending, but also a beginning of enhanced understanding that serves to protect future potential victims. The man who had terrorized multiple states and claimed dozens of lives met his end in a small room in Florida, surrounded by witnesses who represented the justice he had evaded for so long. The psychology that had enabled his crimes was finally defeated by the very system he had tried to manipulate, providing a final demonstration that intelligence and charm cannot ultimately overcome accountability and justice. As our comprehensive psychological journey through the mind of Ted Bundy approaches its conclusion, we now examine the profound and lasting impact his case has had on criminal psychology, law enforcement, and society's understanding of human evil. Bundy's influence extends far beyond his immediate crimes to reshape how we study criminal behavior, protect potential victims, and comprehend the darkest aspects of human psychology. Understanding this legacy reveals how one individual's pathology can transform entire fields of study and influence societal approaches to safety and justice for decades after their death. The psychological impact of Bundy's case on the field of criminal profiling cannot be overstated. His sophisticated manipulation techniques, geographic mobility, and ability to evade detection for years challenged existing assumptions about serial killer behavior and forced the development of new analytical approaches. Modern criminal profiling techniques still reference patterns identified in Bundy's case, and his crimes provided crucial data for understanding how intelligent predators operate and adapt to investigative pressure. Bundy's influence on law enforcement training and procedures represents one of his most significant legacies. His case demonstrated the importance of interjurisdictional cooperation, the need for sophisticated communication systems, and the value of behavioral analysis in complex investigations. Modern approaches to multi-state criminal investigations owe much to lessons learned from the challenges of tracking Bundy across multiple jurisdictions and the eventual coordination that led to his capture. The psychological insights gained from studying Bundy's manipulation techniques have influenced training for mental health professionals, educators, and anyone who works with potentially vulnerable populations. His case provided clear examples of how sophisticated predators identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities, leading to better recognition of warning signs and more effective protective strategies for potential victims. Bundy's impact on public awareness of serial killing transformed how society understands and responds to these crimes. Before his case, serial killing was often viewed as rare and easily recognizable. But Bundy's sophisticated persona and broad geographic range demonstrated that such predators could operate anywhere and appear completely normal. This awareness has led to more vigilant public attitudes and better protective behaviors among potential victims. The psychological analysis of Bundy's case influenced legal approaches to defending against charges of serial murder and the prosecution of complex, multi-jurisdictional crimes. His self-representation in court, his manipulation of legal proceedings, and his strategic use of information all provided lessons for legal professionals about managing sophisticated criminal defendants and protecting the integrity of legal processes. Bundy's influence on media coverage of criminal cases established patterns that continue to shape how high-profile crimes are reported and analyzed. His case demonstrated both the potential benefits and dangers of extensive media attention in criminal investigations, leading to more sophisticated approaches to managing information flow and public communication during complex investigations. The psychological impact of Bundy's case on victim advocacy and support services led to improved approaches to helping families of crime victims and survivors of attacks. His case highlighted the long-term psychological effects of violent crime on families and communities, leading to better understanding of trauma and more effective support systems for those affected by similar crimes. Bundy's influence on academic research in criminal psychology provided a wealth of data for understanding personality disorders, psychopathy, and the development of antisocial behavior. His case became a cornerstone of criminal psychology curricula and continues to be studied by researchers seeking to understand how extreme antisocial behavior develops and manifests in highly intelligent individuals. The psychological lessons from Bundy's case influenced approaches to risk assessment and threat evaluation in various professional contexts. His ability to maintain a successful facade while harboring violent intentions led to better understanding of how to identify potentially dangerous individuals who may not display obvious warning signs of violent behavior. Bundy's impact on public policy regarding criminal justice issues extended to debates about capital punishment, parole procedures, and the management of high-risk offenders. His case provided clear evidence of the extreme danger posed by certain types of criminals and influenced policy discussions about how society should respond to individuals who demonstrate such sophisticated and persistent antisocial behavior. The psychological insights gained from Bundy's confessions and interviews influenced therapeutic approaches to working with antisocial personalities and violent offenders. His case provided rare detailed information about the internal psychology of a serial killer, leading to better understanding of how such individuals think and feel about their crimes and victims. Bundy's influence on security procedures and safety protocols can be seen in numerous contexts, from college campuses to public facilities. His targeting of young women in educational settings led to improved security measures and safety education programs designed to protect potential victims from similar predators who use charm and deception rather than obvious force. The psychological impact of Bundy's case on popular culture has been both extensive and problematic, leading to numerous books, films, and documentaries that have shaped public understanding of serial killing. While this attention has increased awareness of these crimes, it has also raised concerns about the potential glorification of criminal behavior and the psychological impact of media attention on potential copycat offenders. Bundy's influence on international criminal justice systems extended beyond the United States to affect how other countries approach multi-jurisdictional crimes and criminal profiling. His case provided a template for understanding how sophisticated predators can operate across large geographic areas and the importance of international cooperation in tracking such criminals. The psychological lessons from Bundy's case influenced approaches to preventing sexual violence and protecting vulnerable populations. His targeting methods and manipulation techniques led to better understanding of how predators identify and approach victims, resulting in more effective prevention, education, and protective strategies. Bundy's impact on forensic science and evidence collection procedures came from the challenges of linking his crimes across multiple jurisdictions and time periods. His case demonstrated the importance of consistent evidence collection protocols and the value of maintaining detailed records that can be compared across different investigations. The psychological insights gained from studying Bundy's case influenced approaches to treating individuals with personality disorders and antisocial tendencies. His case provided clear evidence of the limitations of traditional therapeutic approaches with severe psychopaths, while highlighting the importance of early intervention with at-risk individuals. Bundy's influence on criminal justice education led to his case being included in curricula for law enforcement training, legal education, and criminal psychology programs. His crimes provide a comprehensive case study that illustrates numerous important concepts in criminal behavior analysis and investigation techniques. The psychological impact of Bundy's case on society's understanding of evil challenged comfortable assumptions about human nature and the relationship between intelligence and morality. His case forced recognition that sophisticated education and apparent social success could coexist with extreme antisocial behavior, leading to more nuanced understanding of human psychology. Bundy's influence on victim protection strategies led to improved approaches to recognizing and responding to manipulation tactics used by predators. His case provided clear examples of how sophisticated criminals can exploit normal social behaviors and helping instincts, leading to better education about protective strategies without promoting paranoia or social isolation. The psychological lessons from Bundy's case influenced modern approaches to threat assessment in workplace settings, educational institutions, and other environments where public safety is a concern. His ability to maintain professional relationships while harboring violent intentions led to better understanding of how to identify potentially dangerous individuals in professional contexts. Bundy's impact on the field of victimology led to better understanding of victim selection patterns and the psychological factors that make certain individuals more vulnerable to predatory behavior. His case provided detailed information about how predators identify and target victims, leading to more effective prevention strategies. The psychological insights gained from Bundy's case continue to influence ongoing research into criminal behavior, personality disorders, and violence prevention. His case remains relevant to current research questions about the development of antisocial behavior and the effectiveness of various intervention and prevention strategies. Understanding Bundy's lasting legacy helps us recognize how individual cases can transform entire fields of study and influence societal approaches to complex problems. His case demonstrates both the destructive potential of severe personality disorders and the capacity of society to learn from tragedy and develop better protective strategies. The impact we've examined tonight shows how Ted Bundy's crimes, while representing ultimate evil, also contributed to advances in understanding and preventing similar crimes. His case became a catalyst for improvements in criminal investigation, victim protection, and public safety that continue to benefit society decades after his execution. The legacy of psychological insight gained from studying Bundy's case serves as a permanent contribution to human knowledge about criminal behavior and the protection of society. While his crimes represent some of the worst aspects of human behavior, the understanding gained from studying his psychology helps protect future potential victims from similar predators. As we prepare for our final segment examining the ultimate meaning and lessons of Bundy's case, his lasting impact on multiple fields demonstrates how thoroughly his psychology has been studied and integrated into modern approaches to criminal justice and public safety. The evil he represented has been transformed into knowledge that serves to protect others. The transformation of Bundy's destructive legacy into protective knowledge represents one of the few positive outcomes that can emerge from such tragedy. His case stands as a permanent reminder of the potential for human evil while simultaneously providing tools for recognizing and preventing similar crimes. As we reach the conclusion of our comprehensive psychological journey through the mind of Ted Bundy, we must now synthesize everything we've learned and extract the crucial lessons that his case provides about human psychology, criminal behavior, and the protection of society. This final analysis examines what Bundy's psychology teaches us about the nature of evil, the development of antisocial behavior, and how we can use this knowledge to prevent future tragedies. Understanding these ultimate lessons transforms the horror of his crimes into knowledge that can serve to protect others. The overarching psychological lesson from Bundy's case is that evil can emerge from the corruption of normal human capabilities rather than from obvious psychological dysfunction. His intelligence, charm, and social skills qualities typically associated with positive outcomes became tools for predation when combined with severe personality disorders and complete absence of empathy. This teaches us that threat assessment must consider how positive qualities can be perverted to serve antisocial purposes. Bundy's case demonstrates the crucial importance of early intervention when warning signs of severe personality disorders appear in childhood and adolescence. The progression from early antisocial behavior to sophisticated criminal activity shows how untreated psychological problems can escalate over time, developing into patterns that become increasingly resistant to change. This understanding emphasizes the value of early identification and intervention programs for at-risk youth. The psychological development we've traced throughout Bundy's life reveals how childhood trauma, genetic predisposition, and environmental factors can combine to create optimal conditions for the emergence of severe antisocial behavior. While many individuals experience similar risk factors without becoming criminals, understanding these developmental patterns helps identify circumstances that require enhanced monitoring and support to prevent negative outcomes. Bundy's sophisticated manipulation techniques teach us that predators can exploit fundamental human social instincts and cultural expectations to gain access to victims. His case reveals how qualities like attractiveness, education, and apparent respectability can serve as psychological camouflage that allows predators to operate undetected. This knowledge helps develop better recognition of manipulation tactics and more effective protective strategies. The geographic scope of Bundy's crimes demonstrates how modern mobility and jurisdictional boundaries can be exploited by sophisticated criminals to evade detection and prosecution. His case led to improved coordination between law enforcement agencies and better systems for sharing information across jurisdictions. These improvements continue to benefit investigations of complex multi-jurisdictional crimes. Bundy's case reveals the psychological importance of understanding how antisocial individuals can compartmentalize different aspects of their lives to maintain normal social functioning while committing horrific crimes. This insight helps explain how dangerous individuals can hide in plain sight and emphasizes the need for vigilance even in apparently safe social and professional environments. The psychological analysis of Bundy's victim selection patterns provides crucial insights into how predators identify and target vulnerable individuals. His targeting of intelligent, attractive young women in educational settings reveals how predators can exploit specific environments and social situations. This knowledge helps develop more effective safety education and protective protocols for vulnerable populations. Bundy's evolution from manipulation to violence demonstrates how criminal behavior can escalate when psychological needs cannot be satisfied through lesser antisocial acts. Understanding this escalation pattern helps identify when individuals may be progressing toward more serious criminal behavior, potentially enabling intervention before violence occurs. The psychological study of Bundy's confessions reveals how sophisticated criminals can continue to manipulate even when cooperating with authorities. His strategic use of information and continued attempts to control narrative during confession processes provide important lessons for law enforcement about managing high-profile criminals and evaluating the reliability of admissions from manipulative offenders. Bundy's case demonstrates the psychological importance of understanding how personality disorders can affect response to traditional therapeutic interventions. His apparent immunity to conventional rehabilitation approaches highlights the need for specialized strategies when dealing with severe antisocial personalities and the importance of realistic assessment of treatment prospects for different types of offenders. The media attention surrounding Bundy's case provides psychological lessons about the potential dangers of providing extensive publicity to sophisticated criminals who seek attention and recognition. His obvious enjoyment of media coverage and ability to manipulate public perception through interviews and statements demonstrate how media attention can serve the psychological needs of narcissistic criminals. Bundy's influence on popular culture raises important psychological questions about the impact of criminal celebrity on public attitudes and potential copycat behavior. His case became a cultural phenomenon that continues to generate books, films, and documentaries, raising concerns about the potential glorification of criminal behavior and its psychological effects on vulnerable individuals. The psychological insights gained from studying Bundy's case have practical applications for improving personal safety and threat recognition. Understanding his manipulation techniques, targeting patterns, and approach methods helps individuals develop better protective instincts and recognition of potentially dangerous situations or individuals. Bundy's case provides psychological evidence for the importance of trusting instincts and maintaining healthy skepticism even when dealing with apparently trustworthy individuals. His victims often experienced initial discomfort or suspicion that they dismissed due to his sophisticated manipulation techniques. This teaches us the value of taking psychological warning signals seriously. The study of Bundy's psychology contributes to broader understanding of how societal factors can enable or constrain antisocial behavior. His ability to exploit cultural expectations and social norms demonstrates how predators can weaponize society's own values and assumptions. This understanding helps develop more sophisticated approaches to social protection that account for how cultural factors can be manipulated. Bundy's case reveals the psychological importance of understanding how evil can persist and adapt over long periods rather than burning out quickly. His decade-long criminal career demonstrates that sophisticated antisocial behavior can be sustained indefinitely without external intervention, emphasizing the importance of persistent investigation and the danger of assuming that criminal behavior will naturally diminish over time. The psychological complexity of Bundy's case challenges simple explanations for criminal behavior and demonstrates the need for sophisticated, multifactorial approaches to understanding and preventing antisocial behavior. His case shows how biological, psychological, and social factors can interact in complex ways to produce extreme outcomes that resist simple categorization or explanation. Bundy's psychology reveals the crucial importance of empirical, evidence-based approaches to criminal justice and public safety, rather than relying on intuition or cultural assumptions about criminal behavior. His case challenged numerous preconceptions about what dangerous people look like and how they behave, demonstrating the value of systematic study and analysis. The psychological lessons from Bundy's case extend beyond criminal justice to influence understanding of human nature, moral development, and the relationship between intelligence and ethical behavior. His case forces recognition that cognitive abilities and moral development can proceed independently, with potentially catastrophic results when high intelligence is combined with severe moral deficits. Understanding Bundy's psychology provides insights into the nature of conscience and empathy that have implications beyond criminal behavior. His apparent complete absence of genuine emotional connection to others reveals how fundamental these capacities are to normal human functioning and social cooperation. The psychological analysis of Bundy's case contributes to ongoing debates about free will, moral responsibility, and the appropriate societal response to individuals with severe personality disorders. His case raises complex questions about culpability and treatment that continue to influence legal and ethical discussions. Bundy's case provides psychological evidence for the importance of maintaining robust social institutions and support systems that can identify and assist at-risk individuals before they develop into threats to public safety. His progression from troubled youth to sophisticated predator demonstrates how early problems can escalate without appropriate intervention. The study of Bundy's psychology reveals the continuing need for research into the causes and prevention of antisocial behavior. His case raises numerous questions about genetic predisposition, environmental influences, and intervention strategies that require ongoing investigation to develop more effective prevention and treatment approaches. Understanding the psychological lessons from Bundy's case helps us recognize that evil is not mysterious or incomprehensible, but results from identifiable patterns and processes that can be studied and potentially prevented. This knowledge provides hope that through continued research and vigilance, similar tragedies can be avoided. The ultimate psychological lesson from Ted Bundy's case is that human psychology contains the potential for both extraordinary good and devastating evil, and that understanding this potential is crucial for protecting society and helping individuals develop in positive directions. His case serves as a permanent reminder of the importance of nurturing empathy, moral development, and healthy psychological growth. As we conclude our journey through the psychology of one of history's most notorious criminals, we carry with us knowledge that can help protect others and prevent similar tragedies. The horror of what Ted Bundy did cannot be undone, but the understanding gained from studying his psychology can serve future generations in recognizing and stopping such predators before they can perfect their deadly craft. The abyss of human psychology that we've explored tonight contains valuable lessons about the nature of evil, the development of antisocial behavior, and the protection of society. Through understanding comes the power to prevent, protect, and heal. The psychological journey we've completed serves not to glorify evil, but to understand it so completely that it can never again operate with such devastating effectiveness. Sleep well, knowing that the knowledge gained from studying the darkest aspects of human psychology serves to illuminate the path toward a safer and more understanding world. The evil that Ted Bundy represented has been transformed through study and analysis into tools for protection and prevention that honor his victims by working to ensure that no one else suffers as they did. In examining the mind behind such calculated evil, we ultimately affirm the value of empathy, compassion, and human connection, the very qualities whose absence made Ted Bundy's crimes possible. Understanding evil helps us recognize and cherish good, making us better equipped to protect what is precious in human nature while remaining vigilant against those who would exploit and destroy it. The psychological journey ends, but the vigilance continues. Through understanding the mind of Ted Bundy, we become better equipped to recognize, prevent, and stop similar predators before they can claim innocent victims. This knowledge is his ultimate legacy, not the evil he did, but the understanding that can prevent others from following his path into darkness.